Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Welcome back to another episode of the Metabolic Link podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dom D'Agostino, and I'm thrilled to have Dr. Mary Newport joining me today for today's episode. She is a seasoned pediatrician and also a neonatologist with over 30 years of experience. She's been involved in founding and directing the neonatal intensive care unit in Tampa Bay area. She then transitioned in her career to home hospice care and health risk assessments. Dr. Newport witnessed firsthand the transformative effects of a ketogenic nutritional program, at first using coconut oil and then MCT oil, and then using exogenous ketone supplementation in her husband, Steve, who had early onset Alzheimer's disease. Inspired by this experience, she has become internationally recognized as an author, a speaker, speaking at Metabolic Health Summit in the past, advocating for ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain. Dr. Newport has written many books, including one of the books, Clearly Keto, for healthy brain aging and Alzheimer's prevention. And Dr. Newport has been really giving back so much to the community, and I'm very excited for you to listen to this podcast. I want to mention that if you're interested in ad-free episodes of the podcast, please be sure to check out all the exclusive content available at our membership site, the Metabolic Initiative. That's at membership.metabolicinitiative.com to learn more about the incredible benefits of becoming a member. Thank you for supporting this episode and continuing to make the Metabolic Link podcast possible. Dr. Mary Newport, thank you so much for joining us. We have so much to talk about. As mentioned previously, this could be a 10-parter, but thank you so much for being on the Metabolic Link podcast. We get so many questions from patients who have an interest in Alzheimer's disease and dementia and the etiology of that, but most importantly, what actionable things that people can do to metabolically manage Alzheimer's disease. And also, I think the second part of what we'll talk about the etiology of Alzheimer's disease, potentially as an infectious agent. So there's this hypothesis that we'll talk about, the antimicrobial hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, that's more or less advanced in large part due to Dr. Tanzi, who is the chair of Harvard neurology, and he has sort of advanced this idea of Alzheimer's etiology being kind of like, well, the smoking gun is elusive and inflammation is a driver. So we'll talk about that. But and that'll more or less be the second part, because I think it really ties into some of your experience. But before we begin, welcome everybody to the Metabolic Link podcast. Thank you so much for joining. Please be sure to like the podcast and leave a comment. That helps us get the message out there. I'm going to give Dr. Mary Newport is a medical doctor. She's got a long bio, but I have the short version, which is still kind of long. She was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. She graduated from Xavier University in Humanities and Pre-Medicine and the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. She completed training in pediatrics at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, in neonatology at the Medical University Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. She's board certified in both pediatrics and neonatology, the care of sick and premature newborns. She practiced neonatology for 30 years and was the founding director for 2 newborn intensive care units, or NICUs, in the Tampa Bay area, Florida. More recently, she's gained, or for the past more than a decade now, she's gained experience at the opposite end of the spectrum while making home visits to people with a variety of chronic illnesses, including Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and other dementias and neurological conditions. In 2008, which was right around the time I discovered kind of what you were doing and finding, she implemented a ketogenic nutritional intervention with coconut oil and medium chain triglyceride oil that dramatically helped her husband, Steve Newport, who had early onset Alzheimer's disease. In 2010, she guided her husband through the first pilot study using beta hydroxybutyrate monoester in a person with Alzheimer's, and co-authored a case report published in Alzheimer's and Dementia. That case report is 2015. And a co-author on that, I think maybe he was a senior author, the late Dr. Richard Veach,
Right.
who was also an inspiration and in many ways a mentor to me. Her husband lost the battle with Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia in 2016, and Dr. Newport carries on his legacy as the author of 3 books, or 4 maybe now, an
Yeah.
international speaker on ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain. Her latest book is entitled, well, there was a complete book of ketones that came out in 2019. And then we have Clearly Keto, which I had the honor of writing the forward to, along with Melanie Brownlow, Dr. Melanie Brownlow, who was a PhD student at the Alzheimer's Center that was inspired by your work and did mouse studies sort of on ketogenic therapies. Dr. Newport is now a certified ketogenic nutrition specialist through the American Society of Nutrition and is currently working on a new book that has just come out on ketogenic strategies. So I'm kind of reading an older bio, but maybe tell people about, well, let me just go through the 3 books that I have here.
Okay.
Alzheimer's disease, What If There Was a Cure?
Mhm.
So that was the pamphlet that you had sent me when we first met, and I saw your news story at the St. Pete Times. And then you had the book come out, Coconut Oil and Low Carb Solution for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Other Diseases. That was 2015. The complete book of ketones, which is a go-to book when people ask me about, well, how do I learn about ketones? This is a new topic for me.
Mhm.
The Practical Guide to Ketogenic Diets and Ketone Supplementation. That's 2019. And then you have Clearly Keto. I forget the date on this, but 2021 or 22?
2022, the end of
2022.
2022. Mhm.
Okay. And maybe tell people about your next book, because I mean,
Yeah.
your books, there's writing scientific papers, which you have done, but
Mhm.
the books is really bridging the gap. And
Yeah.
that's what we need for ketone metabolic therapy and for people to understand the science and application of ketones. So maybe tell
Yeah.
people about the latest book.
Yeah. Well, so this is actually the third edition of my first book. This
Oh,
came
that's
out
right.
in
Yep.
September of this year. So Alzheimer's
Yep.
disease. What if there was a cure? The story of ketones, and it's way too thick.
Wow. Wow.
It has a lot of
Yeah.
new information because there was a
Yep.
10-year gap between the second and the third.
Yep.
I'm working on a book now that it's completely different, really. It's not about ketones, it's about saturated fats. And where did this idea that we should eat a low fat diet and replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, where did that all come from? And this has
Yep.
been about a year-and-a-half project now, and I've been reading basically the complete reports of things like the 7-country study. There was one called the National Diet Heart Study that you almost never hear
Mm.
about. It's really hard. I had to borrow the book, the report that was over 400 pages from a 98-year-old investigator on the 7 countries study and on these other studies that he worked with Ansel Keys on. His name's Dr. Henry
Yep.
Blackburn. Yeah, he's 98 years old, and he loaned me the book. I had to send it back to him, but now I want to buy it from him.
Hmm.
But just a fascinating, read of all it was called Mr. Fit, MR Fit, and the Framingham studies, and just all of these studies, I've been reviewing to try to figure out where this idea came from and was it really justified. And
Yeah.
basically, it wasn't really justified. They never proved. They did show repeatedly that if you substitute um, polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat, that it did lower cholesterol levels on average. Not everybody.
Yeah.
There people were
Yeah.
all over the place, but the average, there would be a reduction. But really did not ever prove that eating a lower fat diet had any effect on. It didn't even affect cholesterol levels. Eating 10% less
Yeah.
fat, like dropping from 40 to 30%, didn't further reduce cholesterol levels,
Yeah.
and it didn't decrease mortality from heart disease
Yeah.
in any of these studies. None of them, of these major studies, ever showed this. And
Yeah.
so, but yet it's became our dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980, and it's
Yeah.
revised
Yeah.
every 5 years after. And part of the impetus for doing this now is that they're in the middle now of revising the guidelines guidelines that are going to come out in 2025.
Yeah.
So I've been, inputting public comments about that. I'm a pediatrician. That's my
Yeah.
first love,
With
and
Nina Teicholz, I can imagine you're communicating with her on
yeah,
this.
I have
I'll be
communicated with
interviewing
her
her
about that.
soon. Okay.
And
Okay, great.
yeah,
Mhm.
but children have gotten obese. I mean, obesity has increased by more than triple in children, even very young children. It's something like 10% of children between ages 2 and 19 are extremely obese. 10%.
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
overall, it's
Mhm.
about 42% that are overweight, obese, or extremely obese. And this is a huge increase from before these guidelines went into effect. And, for example, they want children to eat low fat and fat-free dairy.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that I kind of harp on. And so I wrote up a thing, public comments about that. Children go from breastfeeding, which has 50% fat, half of it saturated fat. And then, when they're advanced to, coming off formula, they go on, cow milk or whatever. The parents
Yeah.
are told you have to give them low fat or fat-free milk and dairy at a
Yeah.
really critical point where their brains, growing and developing. The brain's very lipid rich, full of cholesterol.
Yeah.
So, that's one of my things. The other, one of the other impetuses is, here I'm telling people to eat coconut oil. So coconut oil has a
Yeah.
lot of mythology behind it, that's an artery clogging fat and that it raises your cholesterol and all of this. So, that was one reason why I really wanted to look at, is this justified? So
Yeah.
that's what the book is going to be about.
Well, we have to do another podcast on that
Yeah.
book. And what will the name of the book? I'm curious if you chose a title
Um,
yet, because I mean this is a huge problem that also is in part of the etiology for Alzheimer's disease too,
mhm,
because just metabolic health in general,
it is.
and it does tie into that. And so
Yeah.
yeah, do you have a title
I
for
kind
that
of
book?
have a working title. It's
Okay.
called The Fat Truth, a deep
Oh,
dive
that's good.
into the anti-fat campaign that made us fat.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
Something like that. My
Yeah.
friend suggested that I have a little lady diving off a diving board into an egg yolk
Yeah.
and egg yolks in a coconut shell.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, just for the right, yeah, that's what I had for breakfast this morning. Had some eggs, including rich in egg yolks and liver, and actually some clams. So it's kind of a unique breakfast I had this morning. But
Yeah.
I want to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to Genova Connect, who is a sponsor of this episode. Genova Connect is powered by Genova Diagnostics, and they offer lab testing that you can order online and actually use this lab test in the comfort of your own home. If you're looking to optimize your metabolic health to achieve peak performance with personalized recommendations, this lab testing company is definitely for you. Whether it's gut health, hormonal health, nutritional status, nutritional insights, these tests allow you to set a baseline, and then they provide clarity along your journey as you're adjusting your diet and optimizing your metabolic health. People were sending me their Genova Connect lab reports a while back, and actually looking at the lab reports inspired me to look more into the company. And like I mentioned, I use the products myself, and I think it's an incredible company and gives incredible insight into your metabolic health. Genova Connect is offering you a 15% off of any test kit that you use when you use the code metabolic link at gdx.net/the metabolic link. Now back to our episode with Dr. Mary Newport. So I think we can dive into a lot of people that are listening may already be familiar with your story,
Mhm.
but I think it
Mhm.
would be good to give like a quick overview
Yeah.
of the background, and especially Steve, who I had the pleasure of meeting. And
Mhm.
for everybody out there, Dr. Mary Newport really inspired me to go down this path of I guess 2008. I was really interested in the ketogenic diet, and then saw your report on MCTs and had no idea that medium chain triglycerides could be a source to produce hyperketonemia, to increase ketones. And
Mhm.
you had did a little investigation on the drug AC 1202, or the patent for that, and discovered
Mhm.
that was caprylic triglyceride.
Right.
and it was a ketogenic fat that had therapeutic potential. And that turned me on to, I knew of ketone salts because we were using sodium beta hydroxybutyrate. And then later on, we went on to basically kind of spearhead the idea of doing a ketone salt and spreading it across all different electrolytes. So sodium,
Mhm.
potassium, calcium, magnesium. And then, but you had connected with Dr. Richard Veach,
Mhm.
who was very interested in your case, and that led to sort of the idea of going down the ketone ester route. And then that in 2009, after communicating with you, that started a whole new direction for my lab,
Wow.
which I was stuck at that point because the military was not really keen about the ketogenic diet at that point in time. Interestingly, they are now, but it steered me into the direction of investigating various ketogenic agents for military applications, oxygen toxicity. So 2009. And during that time, we had a lot of communication and still do.
Yeah.
But you inspired that path. And I just want to thank you for that. And that was
Oh, you're
very, you
very
had,
welcome.
I think you got the most audacious award back in, yeah, and that you faced a lot of resistance and spearheading this idea. So maybe tell our audience sort of quickly like how you went down that path and what was sort of the beginning of this
Okay.
path
Yeah.
for you.
So the
Mhm.
beginning. So my husband Steve, when he was 51, he started having memory and other cognitive symptoms. He would forget appointments and that kind of thing. And then he started misplacing the mail and forgetting that he'd been to the bank and the post office and that type of thing. And I mean, he was 51. I'm 2 years younger than him. I was 49 at the time. So he was, I thought this really isn't normal. And he was quite depressed at the time too. So we saw a neuropsychiatrist who evaluated him and he said he could have dementia, which shocked us, right there. But more likely it's depression, put him on an antidepressant, but he kept getting worse. And he was officially diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at age 54. He had a mini mental status test score of 23 out of 30 at that point. There's like these interlocking trapezoids that you're supposed to draw on this test. It was the most bizarre looking. The lines were going in all different directions. That was one of the things that grabbed me when I saw his testing. And MRI was normal at that point, but the doctor, the neurologist said that he had um, dementia. And about 6 months later, as he continued to advance, he had developed tremors and some other issues and had worsened. And he said he has Alzheimer's, that he believed it was most likely Alzheimer's. We did visit the Bird Institute at USF too, for a second opinion, and they agreed that that's what he had. They said he had some unusual additional symptoms. They didn't identify it as Lewy body dementia at the time, but ultimately, as you said, when he donated his brain, we found out that he had predominantly Alzheimer's, but he also had really significant Lewy bodies that were really predominant in the amygdala, which is where
Mhm.
Alzheimer's starts. Also,
Yeah.
basically the spread. So um, he continued to worsen, and in 2008, he was really going downhill pretty fast. He had stopped driving for a couple of years. He couldn't even turn on a computer or use a mouse, and he had been on a computer all day. He was an accountant. He worked for my
Yeah.
medical practice from home, and he, you know, was declining very quickly. He was even losing weight. So
He
there were
was
two clinical
I just
trials.
I want
Yeah,
to just convey because I had the opportunity to meet Steve and I remember going
yeah,
out to the
yeah.
lunch and when he was taking the MCT and seeing the
Hmm.
effects almost
Hmm.
acutely with the tremors and just him becoming more animated. But he was just an observer would say he looked like a healthy, fit
Hmm.
looking
Yeah,
phenotype, if you want to use that word, like
yeah.
his, body composition and everything. And just,
Hmm.
so I
Yeah.
know yeah, he didn't look frail.
No.
He looked relatively like a fit person. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a
Mhm.
fit person. He used to kayak out to some of the
Yeah.
little islands off the coast, near where we live, and he read all day, constantly. He was reading.
Mhm.
He worked out in the yard a lot. He had installed sprinkler systems at our house, and he was really into the landscaping, and he was really active. He wasn't overweight. He was very muscular. He had been done wrestling in high
Yeah.
school, so he was very fit, and you just wouldn't expect somebody like him to get something like Alzheimer's disease early. He had a grandmother that died of some type of dementia when she was 70. But other than that, there wasn't really a family history.
Yeah. However, he was ApoE4
E4, yeah, four,
homozygous,
three,
right?
four,
Oh,
yeah,
4-3. He was
heterozygous,
4-3,
yeah,
heterozygous.
four,
Okay.
three.
Yeah.
Yeah, so higher
Yeah.
risk, but
Yeah.
not especially higher risk for early onset. It's more the
Yeah.
homozygous, that
That's
do,
right.
it does happen, but
Yep.
yeah. So he was not, you just wouldn't expect him to get Alzheimer's, especially not that early. And,
Yep.
like you said, I happened on he was going to try out for 2 clinical trials 2 days in a row. And all of this, the way it came together was just like a perfect storm. It's too many coincidences. But so I'm reading about the two drugs the night before the first screening for the clinical trial, and I happened on a press release about this medical food, AC1202, that was going to come out about a year later, but they had already done a couple studies. They had a pilot study in which 9 of 20 people, they came like 2 days. They had a single dose of, it was 40 grams of C8. That's a lot. I
That's a lot.
suspect a
Yep.
lot of them ended up in the
Yeah.
bathroom for a
Yeah.
while. But another day they got a placebo drink, and
Yeah.
they had 9 out of 20 improved on the day that they got the MCT, and significantly improved. And this was mainly the ApoE3 people. That wasn't the ApoE4 people did not seem to respond. Although,
Yeah.
well, Sam Henderson was the one who came up with the idea and had patented this. And he told me that there were ApoE4 people that had improved,
Yeah.
but
I
it
remember
just
that.
averaged out. When you averaged them out, there
Yeah.
was no improvement,
Yeah.
because so anyway, so I couldn't do anything about it. He went for the screening. He had a mini mental status score of only 14 out of 30. He needed 16 to qualify. So
Yeah.
we were really disappointed, and the doctor had him draw a clock. And I have his original drawing here. This is the clock that he drew.
Yeah.
And
I
you can
remember
see that
distinctly seeing those pictures in the St. Pete Times,
yeah.
like the front page about the
Mhm.
story, and
Yeah.
thinking at the time I wasn't even aware of the clock test. I knew of the mini
Yeah.
mental status exam, but
Yeah.
yes, yeah, it doesn't
Few
look
little
like a clock.
circles.
Yeah,
It's very
yeah,
disorganized. A few
yeah,
numbers. I got the numbers right, but they were just a few of
hmm
them. And
yeah,
and so the physician that was screening him said that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, and I really kind of knew it, but this really hit home. When I saw that drawing, I was pretty shocked. So I had read the patent application, and that uh, medium chain triglycerides are extracted from coconut oil.
mhm,
And I thought, okay, I knew I could get that. I didn't know I could get MCT oil at that point. And so we stopped at a health food store, and then I went to the USDA website to figure out what the fatty acid composition is of coconut oil. And I learned that it was about 60% medium chain triglycerides, which was C6 to C12. And so I calculated an amount of 35 grams to equal a 20-gram dose that they had used in a longer study. They had a longer study with 152 people that lasted 45 days for some and up to 6 months for others. And,
yeah,
again, almost half of those people have responded. So I'm trying to duplicate this 20-gram dose. And the next day, he was set to screen at USF at the Bird Institute for another trial. This was a different location, different center, different city. And this time I gave him coconut oil. I gave him the 35 grams for breakfast. So the
mhm,
screening was about 4 hours later. And this time he gained 4 points. And what he gained was the day of the week, which was different, where this institute was located, and what floor he was on in the institute. And he had gotten all that right, and the season, which he had not gotten right the day before. So he gained
mhm,
4 points, and he qualified for the study. And
yeah,
at the time, it was kind of mind-boggling. And I thought, did we just get really lucky, or is this real? But I thought we're going to keep this going because the scientific basis seemed sound to me. And I was familiar with MCT oil. I mean, this is the other little bit of a coincidence. Because I'm a neonatologist, we used to add it
mhm,
to the feedings of our very tiny preemies, the babies that are under 2 pounds. We would
yeah,
add it to each feeding. And they would gain weight faster, they would go home faster. And then they started adding it to infant formulas, and we didn't have to do that anymore. They started adding it to premature infant formulas. And because MCTs are in human breast milk, medium chain triglycerides.
Yeah.
So I was familiar with it. I knew what it was. And so, he had responded to the coconut oil. And then, one of the things in the patent application is they said, the ketone level peaks on average around 90 minutes after C8, but the ketones are back to baseline after 3 hours, 3 hours after the dosing. And I thought, well, but your brain needs fuel 24/7, so what do you do the other 21 hours? And so I thought I can just give him more of it. I'll give him some at each meal. And I just got every
Yeah.
cookbook and recipe I could find. And the next day started giving him some with each meal, but I always made sure he got 35 grams at breakfast in the beginning.
Yeah.
And
With
he just,
protein, and that
yeah,
usually that would likely shifts the pharmacokinetic curve to the right, where you have greater sustainment over, more hours, a couple
exactly.
more hours probably. Yeah.
Yeah, and eventually Dr. Veach, well, about 6 weeks later, he measured Steve's ketone levels with just coconut oil, like he had 2 doses that day. And then a couple weeks after that, just the C8. And it,
Mhm.
it did show that, the peak level from coconut. I mean, the ketone levels weren't very high, but the amount Steve was taking, I think, pushed it up higher than if you had an equivalent amount of coconut and MCT oil, like there's a study
Yeah.
with 20 grams of each. Well, coconut doesn't have 100% MCTs.
Yeah.
So, but the level peaked at about 3 hours, but he still had a slight ketone level before dinner time, and he took a second dose then, and it increased. The total ketones were about 0.35 when we
Mhm.
stopped measuring about 3 hours after his second dose, but it was on the rise. So we have no idea how high it got, at that point. And another interesting thing is when you take MCT oil, beta hydroxybutyrate levels are higher, quite a bit higher than the acetoacetate levels, but it was the opposite with the coconut oil. The
I remember that.
acetoacetate levels were higher than the beta
Yeah.
hydroxybutyrate. So maybe that has something to do with it. But he was improving like every
Mhm.
day in the beginning, and he said it was like a light bulb came on in his head the first day. And
Yeah.
but there were things like the tremor in his hand. He would have it when he would first wake up in the morning, but 20 or
Mhm.
30 minutes after getting the coconut oil, it would disappear. And I think
Yeah.
you had seen that
I'd
one
seen
time.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
at this point, I think I remember, talking to you about this, but so there's this way to induce hyperketonemia, but also the
Mhm.
ketogenic diet. So were
Right.
you gravitating towards more of carbohydrate restriction too, or did Steve have food
Mhm.
preferences that would, as the large majority of Alzheimer's patients,
Mhm.
I assume it would be very difficult to do the level of macronutrient
Mhm.
calculations
Mhm.
to induce and sustain prolonged therapeutic ketosis. So, but were you
Yeah.
entertaining that idea with the ketogenic diet in addition?
Well, at that point, I wasn't thinking quite that way, but about
Mm.
2 years earlier, we had switched over from what I call the convenience food diet, really poor diet,
Mhm.
to a Mediterranean style diet. I had read that people with Alzheimer's who, in a study, that who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet lived on average 4 years longer than those who ate the least Mediterranean-like diet. And that was the first inkling that I had that nutrition had anything to do with Alzheimer's, but I thought, okay, we're going to do this. And then I also started giving him DHA supplements at that time, like 900 milligrams a day,
Mhm.
because it was a
Mhm.
study. He couldn't qualify for it, but I thought, why would you get use a placebo for an essential fatty acid? I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't really want him to get the placebo anyway, so I started giving him 900 milligrams a day of that. So he was on already doing that for 2 years.
Yeah.
So we were eating whole, all whole foods and whole
Yeah.
grains. But he was eating a tremendous amount of fruit. He had this sugar craving. And that's
Yes.
really common in people with Alzheimer's. And he would stand literally at the kitchen sink every evening and eat every piece of fruit that was available in the house. He would eat a ton of fruit. And so
Dr.
he
Richard
was,
Johnson, sorry to interrupt, but Dr.
yeah.
Richard Johnson goes into exquisite detail in his books about this
Mhm.
foraging response in
Mhm.
Alzheimer's disease, and
Mhm.
it's pathophysiologically linked to insulin resistance in the brain, and then fructose really can deplete brain ATP and trigger this craving response. He's done a lot of elegant work on
Yeah.
fructose inducing this foraging response. So I
So a
remember
real vicious
distinctly you telling
cycle.
me that.
Yeah, a
Yep.
real vicious cycle. That's something that stopped almost immediately when he started taking coconut oil. He just,
Yeah.
he would eat fruit, but he wasn't doing this anymore. He just kind of stopped doing that. And so, basically, I was increasing the coconut oil every day. And then at about 6 weeks or so, already I had made contact with Dr. Beach and we had talked quite a few times. And he was really pushing me, especially after the levels that he had drawn with the MCT. He said the peak levels are higher. Just forget the coconut oil and just give him MCT oil. And I'm like,
Mhm.
but wait a minute. He improved so much with coconut oil. What if there's something else in coconut oil, that is at play here, something that's synergistic with the ketone, whatever. So I started mixing the two. I started mixing basically a ratio. I played around with it, but it ended up with a 4-to-3 ratio of MCT to virgin
Mhm.
coconut oil. And
Yep.
the MCT, he didn't tolerate C8. He would end up in the bathroom. I mean, even with smaller amounts of it. So we were using the C8, C10, and Dr. Theodore Van Italy too. He was really involved with all of this, and he encouraged me to keep the coconut oil as well. He said he felt the same
Yeah.
way that there might be something else in it. So I just made this mixture, and then I would just slowly increasing it, and eventually he was taking like 9 to 11 tablespoons a day of this combination, and I was still often cooking with virgin coconut oil and that type of thing as well. So it was quite a lot.
It's
And
like 200 milliliters at least or something, right?
it's
Like,
pretty, I think
yeah.
it's like 135 or somewhere around
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it was quite a lot. And at first he started gaining a few pounds and he said, I don't want to gain weight. And but then I realized you can't just add that many calories and expect not to gain weight, even something like that.
Yeah.
So at first we were already substituting it for other fats in the diet, but still
Mhm.
eating some coconut oil, I mean, olive oil and butter, cooking and using that in salads and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And, but he had stopped eating all that fruit and he just lost interest in things like bread and pasta and rice. And he
Mhm.
was actually leaving it on his plate. So I just started not even putting it on his plate.
Mhm.
And really, within probably 3 months or so, he was probably on a pretty good ketogenic diet. We just didn't have
Mhm.
the home monitors to be able to check it at that point, to check his
Yeah.
levels.
Yeah.
But when you look at the amount of fat that he was eating and then mostly protein and vegetables,
Yeah.
I'm sure he was on a ketogenic diet. So, but
So
some really crazy things that improved. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I want to take a few moments to say thank you to Timeline Nutrition, who is a sponsor of this episode. Timeline is a Swiss-based life science company and a global leader in urolithin A research. They've spent 10 years doing research to bring MitoPure to the market. This is a postbiotic that has superior purity and potency. MitoPure enhances the process that we call mitophagy and overall mitochondrial health. I've been experimenting with MitoPure, a form of urolithin A now for 6 weeks and have never felt better. My blood work looks spectacular. It has improved since I've been using it. Timeline is now offering 10% off your first order of MitoPure. Just go to timeline.com/metabolic link and use the code metabolic link, all one word. Now let's get back to our interview with Dr. Mary Newport. Oh, well, just getting back to like the definition of an MCT, and
Oh,
that would include 6, 8, 10, and 12 carbon. Is
yeah.
that the sort of the formal definition? Okay. So maybe at the time, or the general consensus was that we break down fats and the fats don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And when,
Mhm.
long chain fats are packaged into chylomicrons and then, they're transported and whereas medium chain fats and shorter chain fats go
Mhm.
to the liver via
Right,
hepatic portal circulation
right.
and stimulate beta oxidation of, fatty acids.
Mhm.
And then that's part of the ketogenesis pathway where beta hydroxybutyrate there's different estimates I've seen in the literature, but with like a pure C8, maybe 20%. One study, maybe 30% of the C8 gets converted to beta hydroxybutyrate.
Mhm.
But in addition to the ketosis that's stimulated with MCTs, the
Mhm.
medium chain triglycerides get into circulation too. And
Mhm.
is it your understanding too that they cross the blood-brain barrier and then can become a fuel? I actually did not know this until
Oh, yeah.
we did some studies with MCT. We quickly dissected out the hippocampus and then we did metabolomics. And then I saw the MCTs in the metabolomic profile, suggesting that they
Did
were crossing. Yeah.
you see any C12 there? Or was there C12
Uh,
in the MCT or?
I wasn't as interested in that, but
Yeah.
I think there. Well, we just administered like the Now brand,
Oh,
MC
yeah.
with like a
There's a little
six.
bit,
I
there's
think.
about 1% or so lauric acid, C12.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I
There's.
asked that because yeah, there are several different papers, but there's two fairly recent. One was Augustine, I think it's
Mhm.
they're in the Robin Williams group in the UK that
Uh-huh.
showed
Yep.
that C8 and C10 do cross the blood-brain barrier and are converted to ketones. They are used, well,
Yeah.
they're used directly, not converted to ketones necessarily, but converted directly to fuel in the brain.
Yep.
Um,
Robin
and
Williams, the scientist, not the actor. Yeah. So
yeah,
yeah, he's done
right.
some really nice work on C10 too. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Capric.
it's
Yeah. Octanoic
anticonvulsant
acid. Yeah.
activity, and
Yep.
yeah, his anticonvulsant mitochondrial
Yep.
biogenesis is stimulated by C10.
Hmm.
Um, so Karen Borges' group,
Hmm. Yep.
that's a paper Anderson with an EN at the end of 2022. They also they did some, I think these were in vitro studies, but they showed that basically astrocytes prefer the medium chain triglycerides as fuel, and neurons prefer beta hydroxybutyrate. Well, astrocytes nourish, they shuttle fuels to neurons,
Yep.
so it's kind of interesting. I tried to get her interested in looking at C12 because
Yeah.
I have not been able to find a single paper showing that C12 is in the brain, but nobody's looking for it. And I,
Yeah. Yeah.
I tried to interest Robin Williams in studying it, and
Uh-huh.
he said that they actually were wanted to do that, but lauric acid, if you get pure lauric acid, it's hard as a rock. It's not
Oh,
something
really? The
that
Lord
could easily
triglyceride.
be.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah. So, but there must be some kind of studies that you could do mass spec or something in the brain, that would
Oh, yeah.
show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Lipidomics.
if
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
just gave
Yep.
coconut oil, or if you, like there are some really high lauric acid MCT oils. There's like Sports Research has one that's 32% lauric acid.
Hmm.
You could give an MCT oil and see if it shows up.
Hmm.
So I've been trying to interest for years, trying to get somebody to do that,
Hmm.
just to show
Yeah.
that it does. I have heard that C14 crosses, that there are studies showing that. So why
Really?
wouldn't
Uh-huh.
C12?
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well, I know you had brought to my attention the antimicrobial effects of
yeah.
lauric acid and different things, and I want to discuss that, but I want to discuss like take a little bit of a step back and just nutritional issues with nutritional status in dementia and Alzheimer's, like in general. I know when
Yeah.
someone gets admitted into being, doing tests for Alzheimer's disease, they look for a number of different things. They look for things like now they look for like Lyme's disease. Borrelia is starting
Mhm.
to become almost
Oh,
like a standard thing. Well, I think more
but
so in the Northeast, but
mhm,
it's catching on because of the prevalence of Lyme's disease.
mhm,
Borrelia, we'll talk about that, but like syphilis, but also, and it's come to my attention because I'm very interested in different nutritional biomarkers.
mhm,
Vitamin B12, as we get older, we
mhm,
lack the ability to absorb. The bioavailability of B12 goes sharply down because we don't make as much intrinsic factor. And there's a
mhm,
number of different things that contribute to that. But dietarily, in addition to our ability to, the bioavailability also decreases along with probably our nutrition in general. So maybe some comment. I know that low B12 is associated with atrophy of the brain and also atrophy of the hippocampus. And when you restore that, there's actually like that can at least stabilize that, and there's some could be partially reverse that. But and then there's B12 is also associated with like pernicious anemia and things like
right.
that. So I was
Or
wondering if
neurological symptoms, if you're deficient in it, other
yeah.
neurological symptoms.
Did
I think
Steve
peripheral
get that?
neuropathy and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, B12 is just like it's super important,
Mhm.
vitamin for so many different cofactors and metabolic processes and enzymes and things like that. And I forgot to ask you if Steve did get tested for that and if that was something that you tracked, B12.
He did, and his levels
Yeah.
were normal.
Yeah.
But when we visited USF, they encouraged him to take B vitamins, B6 and B12 in
Hmm.
particular.
Yeah.
That was kind of a thing at that point. And I think that, they still recommend, but his levels were normal, and every time
Yeah.
he was tested after that, they were normal. His vitamin D level was very normal. He was
Yeah.
out in the sun all the time,
Always
he
outside.
was
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
outside and he had really good levels. Um, so, he didn't seem to have vitamin deficiencies at the time to
Hmm.
explain it. And well, another thing too that people are deficient in, well, that they just don't get enough of is choline. It's a really common,
Yeah.
like half of people in the U.S. don't meet the daily requirement for choline, even by half.
Really?
And yeah,
Even
yeah, and
with
that's
like
eggs. I
eggs
mean,
and
we've
fish
been
and
told for decades not to eat,
yeah.
so many eggs.
Yeah.
Well, that's the biggest source of it, and liver's a good source of it. I mean,
Yeah.
people don't
Hmm.
eat organ meat so much these days. We
Yeah.
used to routinely, when I was growing up, we'd have liver pretty regularly, and Steve's mom would make cow heart soup and all kinds of
Hmm.
things like that. And people have gotten away from it, but those are some of the big sources of that type of thing. And
Hmm.
it's in some vegetables and nuts, but not very much, and it's in dairy, but not
Yeah.
as much as in, certain meats, but especially eggs and liver, are really rich in it. But
Yeah.
people are deficient. They're just not eating as much, of those types of foods as they used to. And
Yeah.
choline's in every cell membrane. It's very rich in the brain, in as phosphatidylcholine, and then acetylcholine is also deficient, the neurotransmitter, and
Hmm.
Alzheimer's. So if you're not getting enough choline, I mean, this could exacerbate or, symptoms or,
Yeah.
progression possibly, of something like Alzheimer's
Yeah.
and
Yeah. And I know there's a number of different what called nootropic drugs, like smart drugs, paracetam, different that work through a cholinergic, kind of pathway. And actually you take it usually with choline to enhance it. So uh yeah, I guess that's something that could be tested for, but I just knew the B12 was kind of well known. But in general, because you have such a pulse on
Mhm.
the population with your blog and just you've communicated with hundreds of patients. Do you think that nutrition in general is a problem with Alzheimer's patients, and then that just simply improving nutrition from the perspective of eliminating processed food, eliminating, sugar, seed oils,
Yeah,
and that's like a major first step.
yeah,
Maybe we could talk
yeah,
about that and
yeah,
what you've seen and people that you've communicated with.
yeah.
And then we'll kind of gravitate more towards, talking about ketogenic metabolic therapy and the best way to implement that.
Yeah. When I do interviews and I'm asked what is the number one thing somebody should do to maybe try to prevent Alzheimer's, I tell them to quit eating so much sugar.
Yeah.
you know, and that, the ultra processed foods, as we talked about already, full of fructose. They used to be loaded with trans fats too. The
Yeah.
FDA just actually um, revoked their GRAS status in 2015 for trans fats, and there's still a little bit allowed, in foods, but these were really prevalent all through, the 20th century. That's another part of that book that we were talking about earlier that I'm working on.
Mhm.
Um, and um, and then, a lot, there's some studies that suggest that there should be a limit on how much polyunsaturated fat that you eat.
Mhm.
And it's basically there were a couple studies that were not published when they should have been, after they were
Mhm.
completed in the 1960s, that actually the people that were eating high amounts of polyunsaturated fat were had higher cardiovascular and all-cause death rates, than the people
Mhm.
that were just eating the usual amount of saturated fat and not eating the
Yeah.
polyunsaturated, so much of the polyunsaturated fats. It was quite interesting. One of them was a study by Ansel Keys that didn't get published until 2016. It was should have been out around 1969, and another Sydney heart study that was very similar that also showed really poor results in that regard that didn't get published. And a group from, I believe the NIH,
Mhm.
got the recovered data and they published it in 2013 and 2016. But so, trans fats. And ultra processed foods are loaded with soybean oil and other things like that. Often,
Yeah.
um, all kinds of chemicals, preservatives,
Yeah.
synthetic, who knows what they do to us. Synthetic vitamins instead of the natural forms of vitamins. It
Yeah.
tends to be synthetic forms of vitamins that might not be used metabolically as
Yeah.
efficiently or in the same way as the natural vitamins that are in whole foods.
Yeah.
So, I basically encourage people to try to reduce their carbohydrate intake. And,
Mhm.
um, I'm trying to be realistic too, because I'm dealing with mainly older people, some quite elderly, and it's very hard to drastically change your diet to a full-blown classic ketogenic diet, at that point in life. So
Yeah.
I try to encourage people to get down to maybe 50 or 60 grams of carbohydrate a day,
Mhm.
make that vegetables, maybe a little bit of whole grains, and increase the fat in their diet. I encourage them to use MCT and coconut oil. Some people, even the smallest amount, they don't tolerate
Mhm.
it,
Yeah.
but they can still, get into ketosis by manipulating the carbs and the fat that
Yeah.
way. And so a way to ease them into it is I tell them to, which things are the carbohydrates to start your foods, on their plate,
Mhm.
and start by cutting that in half, the portion that they're used to.
Yeah.
And I mean, some people fill up a whole plate with spaghetti before they put something on top of it. And,
Yeah.
cut that in
That's
half.
the
And then
norm.
after a couple of weeks, when you're used to that, cut it in half again. And, so you have now a quarter of a portion that you had been eating. And then increasing the fats in the diet, eating more vegetables, trying to get more colors of vegetables. Each one has different types of vitamins and
Yeah.
phytonutrients in it. And it's a kind of I think maybe
And
a more
fiber.
reasonable
Mhm.
diet that people can commit to for the long haul. And
Yeah.
getting rid of the obvious sweets, sugar sweetened beverages, which have been shown to accelerate brain aging, both memory and, the atrophy that occurs in the brain are greatly accelerated, by we've been drinking one a day, sugary drink, but
I see
people
that
are
as
stuck on
key.
that. They're really stuck on that. And
Yeah.
um, so,
Yeah.
you
Sweet
know,
tea, like,
yeah,
yeah, sugar sweetened
sweet
beverages, sweet
tea,
tea.
yeah, even
If I go to
100%
any
fruit juice,
store,
100%
yeah,
fruit juices.
fruit juices. Yeah. Mhm.
That was one of the things they studied, when they did this, and that people that were drinking, I think it was two or more, maybe it was three, well, over two beverages like this a day. It was like 13 years of advanced, age, the atrophy that had occurred was
Yeah.
13 years older than the people actually were. It was really pretty dramatic. And the same thing
Yeah.
with the memory testing was
Yeah.
very poor. So,
Mhm.
but some people are just stuck on they've got to have that their Coca-Cola for breakfast to wake themselves up or
Or
something.
just a big
It's
glass of orange
frustrating.
juice, toast,
Yeah,
and bowl of cereal. I mean, that was kind
yeah.
of like I admit I kind of had that as a little
It-
kid, and then I gravitated towards,
mhm.
working out and stuff in high school, and then it was like eggs and oatmeal and OJ. And then I gravitated. I think I read the book Barry Sears wrote a book called The Zone
I,
Diet, and I
I
got
think I
interested
heard
in
that one.
that maybe around
Yeah,
the early 90s. And that actually inspired me to major in nutrition,
yeah.
just from, that
Oh,
perspective of,
yeah.
so there are, yeah, nutrition's a major issue with people
Big
with,
issue.
because for
Mhm.
multifactorial, because they gravitate towards easy food, processed
Mhm.
food, sweet food, and food that is probably linked to this foraging response,
Mhm.
with the depletion of
Mhm.
ATP in the brain, and that triggers
Yeah,
cravings and hunger, which Steve did have.
yeah, he did have.
So,
Mhm.
the really important question is that, how, I believe that there's probably a metabolic phenotype. The etiology of Alzheimer's disease is multifactorial, and we're going to get into talking about
Yes,
that.
yeah.
But a hallmark characteristic is glucose hypometabolism. So elevating and sustaining ketone levels is a way to bridge the gap or
Mhm.
fill the gap and restore brain energy metabolism. Along with that, neurotransmitter systems
Mhm.
are intimately linked to mitochondrial function
Mhm.
and brain energy. You know, Chris Palmer has a great
Mhm.
book on this, Brain Energy. But also by shifting your diet and increasing ketones, a major driver that now finally mainstream medicine and
Mhm.
mainstream scientists who study Alzheimer's disease all agree that neuroinflammation is the driver. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
now I think you knew this more than a decade
yeah.
ago, and I remember telling certain individuals about this, and they kind of agreed. And there was, I
Mhm.
know, Dr. Donna Herber, who I work closely with, and like patents and licensing, did her work under the CEO of the Alzheimer's Center at Bird, and did some elegant studies with lipopolysaccharide (LPS), and
Mhm.
that induced a pretty profound amyloid pathology,
Yeah.
in mice. And so it was known that, you stimulate systemic inflammation that stimulates neuroinflammation, and that's a major driver. But let's take a little bit of a step back. And I mean, we kind of already talked about it, but
Mhm.
ketogenic or ketone metabolic therapy, I like to use that word because it sort
Yeah.
of encompasses,
A
it could
broad
be time
spectrum.
restricted
Yeah,
feeding, yeah, which
yeah,
is a state of mild
yeah.
ketosis, ketogenic diets, from the classical ketogenic diet to the modified
Mhm.
Atkins. And then we
Mhm.
have,
Glycemic and
yeah,
MCT
MCT,
modified. Yeah.
yep, ketone
Mhm.
salts, ketone esters, a wide
Right.
variety of ketogenic agents, including 1,3-butanediol, which I don't think is a good for
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, but we could talk about that. But so different, and they're not mutually exclusive. So
Right.
patients can, if they don't like breakfast,
Mhm.
they could have their first meal at lunch or whatever. So
Mhm.
maybe, some simple things that people can do
Yeah,
who have a
yeah.
loved one who, or maybe
Mhm.
susceptible to Alzheimer's disease, how to ease into ketogenic metabolic therapy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so uh, I think people can develop really a personalized plan, I call it,
Yeah.
So people will often start with, adding something like coconut and or MCT oil. And then when they see a positive response, it's like, what else can I do now? So we can tell them about overnight fasting. And some people will put coconut or MCT oil in their coffee in the morning. And there are now some products out there that also have ketone salts in them, and
Mhm.
that you could have, with coffee in the morning, and then just like personally, I do that. I've been doing that since about 2016, and I find that I'm not hungry. I used to be a morning, a wake up hungry, have to eat breakfast as soon as possible person, and now
Yeah.
it's more like noon or one. I have my larger meal of the day at
Mhm.
around then. But I just find doing that, I'm not really hungry. And but you're already in mild ketosis if you're fasting overnight for say 10 or 12 hours. And if you can extend that several more hours, your ketone levels will continue to go up. If you have a
Mhm.
ketogenic drink like that, it will go up even more. So it's a kind of a great way, I think, to start the day and to try to get into sustained ketosis. And then eating, a lower carb diet when you do, lower
Mhm.
carb meals can help perpetuate that, and incorporating more fat into the meals. And of course, adding more MCT or coconut oil could help with that. And then exogenous ketones. Some people will add uh, exogenous ketones maybe mid-morning or,
Mhm.
and mid-afternoon.
Yeah.
Some of the people that I communicate with that have had really extended um, stability
Yeah.
in doing these types of things. And um, yeah, I have a couple of examples if you want to talk about.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I want some
yeah.
examples, and I'll just briefly mention sort of like many things that I tell people that
Mhm.
contact me. Well, I tell them to go get your books, and I think your books are
Mhm.
very they're educational, informative from a science perspective, well referenced, and then they have actionable insights.
Mhm.
everything that you are talking in a
Mhm.
very elegant, kind of very well laid out. Uh,
Right.
I I believe that, I have like a protein centric or protein forward thing.
Mhm.
So if people really centralize protein, which is so important for preventing age-related
Yeah,
sarcopenia,
I agree.
that's kind of like the key. And then that'll kind of push out, if you amp up the protein, then people will generally eat less carbohydrates. If they kind of fill up on
Mhm.
protein, it has a satiating effect. And especially with things like fish that have other like omega-3 fatty acids and things in it. And I'm also a big fan of creatine monohydrate. So there are various forms of creatine on the market, but
Mhm.
creatine monohydrate is probably the most well-studied nutritional supplement, hands down, and it has
Mhm.
impressive effects on cognition and muscle strength and even cancer. There's some studies. So
Yeah.
I think, I view creatine monohydrate as metabolic supplementation,
Mhm.
and
I,
and then
I
and then
yeah,
and then
after you had
ketones
told
are
us
like the
about that.
next, yeah,
Yeah.
and
You had told
and
us about that, and I started giving it to Steve. So we had it
yeah.
as a powder, and I could add it like I made a couple smoothies that I packed as many of his supplements into as I could, plus more
Mhm.
coconut and MCT. We made it with coconut milk and that kind of thing, and protein. I was adding
Yeah.
egg white protein to it.
Mhm.
And anyway, so creatine monohydrate was one of the things that we were
Yeah.
also giving them after we met you, and you had started telling me about some of these things.
Yeah. Like 10
So
grams a day, I think, has been
yeah,
linked to cognitive function, reducing
yeah,
depression, things like
yeah,
that. So these are cheap things that people can do. And
yeah.
also increasing the protein.
The
This may sound
protein,
really high, but like
yeah,
1 gram per pound of body weight is
yeah.
almost a good place to start with, because as we age,
Mhm.
there's anabolic resistance, and a number
Mhm.
of people like Stu Phillips, Dr. Donald Layman has, have careers and kind of studying this. And high protein, unless you have pretty severe kidney function, polycystic kidney disease, or impaired kidney function anyway, you might want to reconsider like the high levels. But generally speaking,
Mhm.
higher protein is actually can improve kidney function, especially if you're low, and if that's replacing processed
Mhm.
sugars and food and things that spike your
Mhm.
glucose levels, which are
Yeah.
pathological to kidneys. Also, eating less carbohydrates will lower your blood pressure a bit,
Mhm.
and then blood pressure is a big driver for decreasing kidney function. So these are all kind of
Yeah.
important
And a big
things. And I
risk
think,
factor for Alzheimer's too.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that
And
kind of
other
resonates in your
dementias.
book
Yeah.
too. I mean, yeah, you talk about, whole food protein sources and things
Mhm.
like that, but
Mhm. Yeah.
maybe talk about some, well, whatever you want to talk about, but maybe some
Yeah.
case people that you've worked with and
Oh, yeah.
kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
examples. Mhm.
Yeah. And first, I want to say too that's
Let's take a brief break to highlight and thank Fatty 15, a sponsor of this episode. Fatty 15 is the world's first and only science-backed, patented, award-winning C15 supplement that supports long-term health and wellness. In fact, fatty 15, or C15, the fatty acid, is the first essential fatty acid to be discovered in 90 years. C15 has been shown to improve mitochondrial function, reduce free radicals. It is more potent and has many advantages over, for example, omega-3 oils. I believe in the science of this product, and I've started using it myself. Fatty 15 is giving you an additional 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/metabolic link and using the code metabolic link at checkout.
when I write about the ketogenic diet or teach people about it, I tell them to especially pay attention to protein, getting adequate protein. That's
Mhm.
like the first thing. I probably go more with, well, I tell them a half gram per kilo. Not per kilo, per pound. So a little over one
Okay.
gram, but up to double that much,
Okay. Yeah.
especially
One,
if they're
one per pound.
active.
Yeah.
and
And fast
bodybuilder, that
metabolism.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. But I mean, I think most people have trouble, especially older people, even meeting that a minimum amount of protein. And I saw this, when I was doing visits, with many elderly people. I was doing hospice care for a while, and then home health risk assessments, and I was going also into assisted livings, and so many really super thin, emaciated looking people, and then, I would have a patient and, I happened to be there when they were having their lunch and this very thin elderly lady who's having memory issues is eating soup, like a clear broth with a few vegetables in it, for lunch.
Yeah.
And, bone broth has, but I don't think it was even bone broth. It was probably bouillon or something. It doesn't have that much protein, so
Yeah.
trying to encourage people and telling them what they need to eat to do that. And
Yeah.
so when I communicate with a whole lot of people by email. I encourage them,
Hmm.
that way too, to make sure that they're getting adequate protein. And I do encourage
Yeah.
exercise, aerobic, but also resistance exercise too,
Yeah.
to try to maintain the muscle mass. So, yeah, so there's one man, he was in California. His wife contacted me in 2012, and at the time he was 82 years old, and he had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. There were three neurologists that believed he had Alzheimer's, and he would stand in the middle of the room like frozen and confused, and was having trouble talking and doing all kinds of strange things, putting strange things in the microwave oven and, all of that. And so his wife, a friend told her about, gave her a link to, I think, a TED talk that I had done at USF. No, no, that was after. It was another video that I had done. And so she started giving him coconut and oil and then MCT oil. She started giving him smoothies. And fairly quickly, within a couple days, she saw obvious improvements. And so he
Hmm.
was another dramatic responder like Steve. He was ApoE33. But he had been he was an elite swimmer. He almost made it into the Olympics, and he was surfing every week when he was 89 years old still,
Yeah.
and swimming every day, So he was also another very active man. He had basically eaten a Mediterranean diet. He came from an Italian family, had been eating a Mediterranean diet his whole life. So he was another one like, why did he get this? But he improved a lot, with coconut and MCT. And then she stayed in touch with me. And when the ketone salts became available in 2016, he hadn't gotten any worse at that point, but she added that and he actually improved more when he started taking ketone salts on top of what they were
Hmm.
doing.
Yeah.
And then in 2018, when the ketone ester, they added that also, so he was
Hmm.
getting two different kinds of exogenous ketones. And, they were tightening up the carbohydrates on the Mediterranean diet. He was still getting this exercise every day. They were doing overnight fasting, and then he was getting the coconut and MCT oil, so he had later evaluations, and he was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which precedes
Hmm.
Alzheimer's disease,
Yeah.
that the last couple times. And at age 94, he had atrial fibrillation for years and had a pacemaker for many years. And
Interesting.
sadly, his battery was like getting low, and he had surgery to replace it. And he went off a cliff, and it wasn't dementia. He just like it was cardiac failure related to, he was 94 years old, to his
Oh,
advanced
okay.
age, and
Yeah.
he passed away a couple weeks after the surgery. But he had never declined into, a state where he was diagnosed again with Alzheimer's disease. He had
Yeah.
maintained,
Hmm.
mild cognitive impairment, but if you're already in Alzheimer's, it's unlikely you're going to recover everything, because there are many neurons that have died. You're not going to be able to recover those, and possibly pathways you've lost. But
Hmm.
the interesting thing about him is that he also had a brain autopsy. He donated his brain, and there were very, very few plaques or tangles anywhere in his brain,
Hmm.
which was
Wow.
incredible. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the opposite of what you would expect. With Alzheimer's, you would expect to have a lot more of that, minimal inflammation. And,
Yeah.
when like Beach tested the ketone ester in mice, the mice, the Alzheimer's model is a transgenic mouse model. Um, the mice who were drinking the ketone ester had much less plaque entangled in their brain. And there
Yeah.
have been a couple of other groups that have confirmed that, with animal studies. So it's like,
Yeah.
and people have suggested, well, maybe he didn't have Alzheimer's. Well, he had all the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So something clearly was going wrong.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he didn't have an amyloid scan. He could have, and he turned it down,
Yeah.
earlier. They were doing an annual evaluation as part of an
Yeah.
NIH long-term
Yeah.
study, and he hadn't gotten that. So, there was no point of comparison, unfortunately. But, he's a success story, and
Yeah.
you
And
know,
it's so for people out there listening, I think it's
yeah.
important to know, they may already know that, Alzheimer's is typically diagnosed, unless you do the amyloid PET scan or whatever, typically diagnosed at autopsy on the brains, right? And I know, the chair of neurology, Dr. Tanzi, I think, even mentioned in his talk, we probably have 30 plus million people
Mhm.
with amyloid pathology that are completely asymptomatic, right?
Right,
And then
with
again, you
major
have
amyloid, yeah, major pathology, and
people
they're
with,
asymptomatic.
yeah, and then
No,
people
no
with
cognitive
hallmark.
symptoms, no memory problems.
Yes,
And yeah.
whereas people who have hallmark characteristics of
Mhm.
Alzheimer's disease in regards to memory problems and things like that, some of those have absent amyloid and tau
Right, right.
pathology or very little. So
Yeah.
that kind of lends, and maybe why, and we can talk about the monoclonal antibodies, aducanumab, and there's a number of them that are largely ineffective, but may
Yeah.
serve, a function to be determined from a prophylactic, preventative standpoint, if you have a predisposition,
Yeah.
but those studies are ongoing, but largely
Yeah.
failed
Yeah.
from
That one
that
actually
perspective.
was withdrawn a few weeks ago from the market.
Oh, yeah, I think I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
withdrawn. They said, well, physicians weren't prescribing it. It's very, very expensive. And apparently
Mhm.
maybe they were supposed to be continuing a large clinical trial, and they didn't say that it had failed, but apparently it was underwhelming. Yeah,
Yeah.
enough that they decided to pull it off the market.
And potential side effects too. So maybe
Mhm.
for our
Yeah.
listeners out there, and for me
Yeah.
too, because I'm not as read up on the subject as I should, maybe a general overview of the monoclonal antibodies, right? That's what they are.
Mhm.
And their sort of why we thought they were going to be effective, and what they do and they don't do.
Yeah. Yeah, they're supposed to prevent further um, increase in beta amyloid plaque, but they also reduce it. The antibodies really reduce it pretty dramatically
Yeah.
sometimes. And,
Yeah.
one of the problems is, these plaques will stick to blood vessels, and you remove
Yeah.
them and it weakens a blood vessel. They can leak. They can cause, it can cause edema in the brain. There's bleeding in the brain, a really common side effect. About 20% have one or the other of those.
Yeah.
And it was for a trade-off of very, very slight improvement and decline over time. It doesn't really even improve cognition, that particular drug. It's supposed to slow decline, but at the risk of a 1 in 5 serious complication. To me, I think that when physicians look at that, they're like, is that really worth it?
Yeah.
At risk.
The
I would
outcome measures are just not
with Steve on
impressive.
that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's been the fate of, there have been more than 40 clinical trials of various drugs that seek to remove beta amyloid plaques from the brain or prevent further buildup of them. And some have even worsened or accelerated Alzheimer's. And that actually happened to Steve. That's my husband. Got into a study. He had
Yeah.
about 2 months after he started coconut oil, he had another screening again. It was for one called semaglutide. It was an oral medication, and um, he had an MMSE score of 20 at that point when he got in. I told him
Yeah.
about what we were doing with the coconut and MCT, and they said, "Oh, we
And
don't think that would have any impact, so we'll
that
let him."
was all driven. I just want to mention that the initial mini mental status exam was 14, and then
14. So
you
this was
continued.
20 out of 30.
And
This was
And he
Mhm.
kept
Months
going
later,
up and up
going up.
with ketogenic therapy. At that
Yeah.
point, when he hit 20, was he on a ketone ester yet, or was it just MCT?
Oh, yeah. The
Okay,
ketone ester came 2 years later.
2 years
So this
later.
was
Okay.
only 2 months. So he was on coconut oil, and I had just started adding MCT oil at that point. Some
Yeah.
MCT. We were still working up on that. So, and he had just steadily improved. I mean, there were just things like was able to tie his shoes again
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
2 months into this, and he had been walking very stiffly. He couldn't run, and his gait had completely normalized. He could run again at about 2 months. And I didn't show his second clock. This was his second
Oh
clock.
yeah. Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
14 days. And then this one was at 37 days after starting the coconut oil.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
big
And
improvement. It's still, but he told me the lines were to try to line up the numbers across from each other. That's what he was
yeah.
doing with the
But it
line.
was like you have objective biomarkers
Yeah.
of cognitives where with the
Yeah.
clock, mini mental status exam,
Yeah.
but you had and I remember talking to you mostly about just the
Mhm.
daily life activities. I mean, that was
Mhm.
probably if there was some way that you can quantify that, that would
Yeah.
not only
Right.
parallel that, but even be higher,
Yeah.
some of the things that he was doing. And for
Yeah.
me, I think the thing that kind of really convinced me that this was, something it's just seeing that acute response to a shot of MCT with him, the tremors, going away almost completely. And
Yeah.
then seeing him become more animated, when we went out to dinner and
Mhm.
thinking,
Mhm.
okay, well,
Mhm.
maybe there was something. I was keenly just tied into the ketogenic diet at that
Yeah.
point, and maybe
Yeah.
the idea of exogenous ketones, but that
Yeah.
that really kind of got me super
Mhm.
interested in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, it's
And
like, something as simple as coconut oil.
yeah,
That's the trouble with convincing a lot of physicians. It's like that's too simple. They won't even read about it or research it at all.
yep, yep.
Yeah, it's been really an interesting process. But so he was in the semaglutide trial, and
Hmm.
he entered it just a little over 2 months after he started the coconut oil. And we found out later that he was on the placebo for 18 months.
Mhm.
So, and I was never sure until we knew that. Is this a drug that's actually benefiting him that he's getting too, or is it strictly the coconut and the MCT?
Yeah.
But he was on placebo, so it was that, and he improved over the first year. There's the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale, cognitive. He improved by 6 points on that, and then activities of daily living, which is how well you can take care of yourself. Basically, he
Yeah.
improved by 14 points out of 78 points on that over the first year. So really dramatic.
Wow.
And he was clearly on the placebo. And then at 18 months, he crossed over to the drug, and he was on it for about 6 weeks. And he had a really serious setback right around that. He developed a cold, and then he had a fever blister, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And
Mhm.
he had like a wound that wouldn't heal for about a month. He would nick himself
Mhm.
shaving. It would bleed for several days, and then he fainted, and his CPK became very elevated. And,
Mhm.
basically, we had to, I decided to pull him out of the study. We were about to go on a trip to Greece, and I thought, what if he gets into really big trouble?
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
going to get to present this information about, coconut and MCT oil at Alzheimer's Disease International Conference. And so we pulled him out of the study. And then later we were called, I got a call to say that they had found that the semaglutide had accelerated Alzheimer's,
I
that it
remember.
actually
Mhm. Yeah.
accelerated it. And
Yeah.
the people who, at the research center, they told me that the people that they thought were on it, there was a change in hair color, and Steve had that during this six
Yeah.
week
Yeah.
that they had gotten significantly worse over the previous year. And
Yeah.
so,
Like
but
a
then
graying
they
of the
came out.
hair. Was his
It was
hair
kind of
like
like a gold color, like a light gold, that
that's
his hair just
interesting?
started
Wow.
growing out in a different color. He looked like he
Yeah.
had, as it grew out, we stopped it at about 6 weeks, but it was real
Hmm.
obvious that, yeah, and they knew that, people who had that almost for sure were on the drug.
Wow.
So
That's interesting side effect. Yeah.
yeah. So when we stopped it, then he had just had the ribbon of color that grew out through his hair, so he had highlights for a while.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Hey,
cool.
Mary, was Steve on any other sort of drug? So I know that people that are on, smoke cannabis or antipsychotic drugs in
Mhm.
particular,
Mhm.
or not so much smoking because nicotine could be actually beneficial, nicotine in and of itself,
Yeah.
but or alcohol that was so just want to clarify, because I think that is could fuel the fire and actually
Mhm.
lead to Alzheimer's
Mhm.
like symptoms and then sort of
Mhm.
what we remove from our lifestyle, whether it be
Mhm.
drugs,
Mhm.
food and some other things could sort of reverse Alzheimer's in some people. And
Mhm.
maybe just a couple comments of drugs
Yeah.
that Steve may or may not have been on
Yeah.
and maybe the
Yeah.
contribution of these things.
Yeah. Well, there's one, there weren't any antipsychotics and, other, unusual drugs, except there was one drug that he was on. It actually ties into the infection thing. Vioxx. It was an
Oh yeah.
anti-inflammatory. It was used
Yeah,
for
yeah, Vioxx.
arthritis. It was on the market for about 5 or 6 years. And this
Hmm.
was like in the
COX-2
late,
inhibitor, right? It's a COX-2 inhibitor.
it's a
Vioxx, right?
COX-2,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Uh-huh.
a
And they
COX-2
pulled it
inhibitor.
for
And
cardiac issues, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
so Steve, he had he was 50, 51 years old, and he had, when he would sometimes do yard work, his foot would swell. And later we found out it was
Mhm.
gout. It just wasn't a typical presentation of it.
Mhm.
But he did see an orthopedic doctor, and the doctor gave him Vioxx, for the pain. So he was taking this,
Mhm.
and he had a little bit of arthritis in his hands too that he was complaining about. And he said it helped so much. So he was taking this regularly for probably a year and a half. And it was during that time, frame that he
Mhm.
also started having these problems. And so it turns out, years later, when I'm trying to figure out what happened to him, I was looking up, different things that he might have been on, and Vioxx was one of them. And it said Vioxx causes Alzheimer's. I got to, I'm like, what? And I found a presentation,
Wow.
and they, basically there had been 3 Alzheimer's studies. Well, yeah, 2 of them were Alzheimer's. One was mild cognitive impairment. And in the 2 Alzheimer's studies, one of them had the people getting Vioxx had twice the death rate. These were people with Alzheimer's. The other one, 4 times the death rate. And they were mostly heart attacks that they had died from.
Heart
But the
attack.
third one was of people with mild cognitive impairment. And they were trying to prevent Alzheimer's, and it actually sped it up. It accelerated it. Starting at four
Mhm.
months of taking the drug, people were progressing from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's in the study. So this was another one that they found that Vioxx accelerated um, the problem, and basically it inhibited COX-2, but it allowed it. Let's see, prostacyclin was suppressed, but thromboxane was remained intact. And
Uh-huh.
this increased the propensity to develop thromboses, for example.
Thrombosis. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Wow,
So
interesting. I
this is
didn't
what
know
they
that.
found
Yeah.
later about the drug.
Okay. Because
Mhm.
COX-2 inhibitors are largely associated, with anti-inflammatory effects, and there's some
Mhm.
renal issues and cardiac issues, but even I take like almost microdose, like
Mhm.
I either an aspirin or I do like half of a leave, which is, and I might do like half of one a week or something like that, just because of the data on it. And at that dose, it's not, toxic, but I do believe that some of these COX-2 inhibitors, and I usually couple it during if I feel, some kind of inflammation, either from working
Mhm.
out the
Mhm.
previous
Mhm.
day or something like that. It's sort of
Mhm.
taming that flame of inflammation, which we're going to talk
Yeah.
about. And
Yeah.
so I want
Yeah.
to pivot a little bit, or
Yeah.
maybe before we do,
Yeah.
again, just generally speaking, what percentage of people do you think are have the metabolic phenotype that are responsive to ketogenic metabolic therapy? So if you have, Alzheimer's population that uh and I have just through many emails of people where people are and you have quantified this and it's some of the
Yeah.
data is in your
Yeah.
book
Yeah.
and on your blog.
Yeah.
Would you say, I tell people usually about 1/3 of people have a noticeable response that have
Mhm.
mild cognitive impairment or something like that, and then maybe 1/3 no response, and or the other 2/3 really just are non-responders, but no one's having a negative response. But
Mhm.
you have more of a pulse on that
Yeah,
on that.
yeah. Well, the thing, I've collected this huge number of emails, from people, but I think they're probably more likely to contact me if they had a positive
Positive.
response.
Yeah.
So I got to present this in Amsterdam at the Alzheimer's Association conference. I had a poster that they actually accepted. I was kind of shocked because they haven't been my friend, for a lot of years
I
early on.
remember.
They just would
I
not
remember that.
study it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't study it. They gave me a hard time about it, but they
Mhm.
accepted my poster. So I went there and presented. But basically what I presented was 288 cases from emails, mostly emails. I had a few letters, handwritten letters that were mailed to
Mhm.
me. And I had a couple of phone calls, where I documented everything that they told me.
Yep.
And I didn't tell people like what kind of, most of them were just cold emails. They had gotten my
Yeah.
contact information from this white paper that I had written in 2008 that got out all over the place. They had my address, both of my phone numbers and my email. So
Mhm.
people would just send me
Yeah.
emails, and
Mhm.
they had tried what I had suggested in the white paper. I told them how much Steve was taking, that I was adding it for each meal. So they were kind of doing that themselves. And The 288 people, they were more than half were Alzheimer's, people with Alzheimer's, and about another 20 or 25% were people that had other types of dementia or mild cognitive impairment. And then there were all kinds of other problems. A lot of people with Parkinson's disease, some with and without memory
Mhm.
problems, and then children with
Yeah.
autism, and people with ALS and MS, and head injuries, and all kinds of people. But for this particular collection, I looked at people that had Alzheimer's, dementia, or some type of other memory impairment or subjective memory complaint.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so 288 of them. And of those, it was 89% that reported some kind of improvement. So I think it was really biased towards, people, if nothing happened, they might not. But I did have, some people that said that they had absolutely no response. And so it
Mhm.
was like over 7% that said they didn't see any response. And there was a few percent that felt like the person had stabilized for at least a few months. They hadn't seemed to get worse.
Mhm.
So, and then I used like verbatim phrases from the emails that they had sent me, or the reports that they had sent me, to try to
Mhm.
categorize what kind of improvements were they reporting. And about two-thirds of them, it was some kind of cognitive or memory improvement. But a lot
Like
of the other
mini mental
people,
stat, like an objective marker, like
not always
MMSE or just
objective.
okay.
Yeah, it
Okay.
was, some of them
Mhm.
did have objective,
Mhm.
markers, but probably most of them didn't. They just,
Mhm.
said that their memory was, there were a lot of things, memory was better. There was one man said he could do mental math again. And I mean, just an assortment of different things like that.
Yeah.
Um, but then, there was another category that was social interaction, behavior,
Mhm.
and mood. I kind of
Mhm.
categorized that all into one thing. Like people will report that they are recognizing family members again, that they're making conversation that makes sense again, those types of things.
Mhm.
There were some people that actually started talking again, a few people that hadn't been talking for a year or longer that literally started
Wow.
talking again, a
Yeah.
few of those. And then physical symptoms, like Steve had tremors, and people that reported improvement in physical symptoms, or improvement in that had started doing activities again that they had stopped doing, like crocheting or reading the newspaper, or yard work or housework, and that kind of thing. Um, and then there were maybe 9 or 10% that they just said they've improved so much, but I would say, can you give me more details? And they didn't give me more details, but they
Mhm.
said they had
Mhm.
improved. So
Yeah.
some people just have trouble putting it into words, I suppose. I
Yeah.
didn't tell them what to expect, and I didn't really prompt them in any way. I would just sometimes ask, can you give me more details? And sometimes
Yeah.
they did, and sometimes they didn't. Some people send me pages and pages of details, and they stayed in touch with me for weeks, months, and years,
Yeah.
about the progress, and just helping them troubleshoot or whatever,
Yeah.
but I got to present this, and I just basically stayed with my poster all day, and I had quite a lot of people stop and talk to me, physicians. There were some that had never ever heard of. These are Alzheimer's researchers and clinicians. They had never ever heard of ketones and Alzheimer's, this whole
Oh yeah.
idea.
I can imagine.
And they had not
Yep.
heard of it. I had a number of dietitians that stopped by. They were really interested in it and wanted to know details. Some talked to me for quite a long time, and we stayed in touch. We've stayed in touch. Um, but it was
Yeah.
interesting. It was fun, to get to do that. And, it's always fun to
Getting the word out
get to
there.
travel and, yeah, get the word out
Yeah.
there.
Well,
I felt, very satisfied, that I finally
yeah,
got to do something at the Alzheimer's. They've had a few presentations on ketones. They've had a few sessions since 2017. Stephen Cunane's
I
usually
was going to
involved.
mention him. We'd be
Yeah,
remiss
yeah,
without mentioning
yeah,
him. So maybe
yeah,
mention a little bit of his work.
yeah.
Yep.
But this year for 2023, he applied for a session and they turned him down. And so there
Wow.
was nothing.
Hmm.
Mine, as far
Yeah.
as I could find, mine was the only poster or presentation of any kind that related to ketones
Hmm.
and Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So that they're really kind of, and he and I have both tried to get through to their VP of Public Relations, who is a PhD,
Yeah.
to try to, they've had presentations, they have funded some of his research.
Hmm.
And, his research with MCT oil and people with MCI, he had a study for 6 months,
Yep.
65 people, did show improvement in all cognitive domains. They also were able to document increased ketone uptake in the brain after taking MCT using PET imaging and
Yep.
increased ketones in white matter and in a
Yep.
specific network that's associated with processing speed, for
Yep.
memory and attention. And but yet, they don't acknowledge at all that this ketogenic therapies could actually improve symptoms in people with Alzheimer's. That none of
Yeah.
the drugs ever claim that they can improve symptoms.
I know. Like,
It's
it,
very frustrating. And they
yeah.
yet this does, and it's a food, and
Yeah.
they won't put it on their website. If you look up coconut or MCT on the website, I haven't checked in the last couple of weeks, but they say their last entries from 2014, and it says this hasn't been studied, so we can't recommend it.
Wow. So yeah,
Yeah,
you have something that's kind of, you can go kind of off the shelf
right. Off the
food
shelf.
that, and if you compare it
Absolutely.
to the
Yeah.
multi-billion-dollar industry of the drugs, it outperforms that. So still, even after all those years, more
Yeah.
than about a decade and a half or
Right.
so after, I got turned on to this from
Hmm.
you. So now I think I want to pivot a little bit to something
Yeah.
that maybe has also been like suppressed a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Yeah.
I have so many notes from some of the things that you had sent. So I want to talk quickly about the NIH, National Institutes of Health sponsored workshop that I sent you a link to that had
Yeah.
a number of different talks, but those talks were basically many of the same people that you had sent me the papers on
Yeah.
and your notes on, and in particular, Dr. Rudolph Tanzi. So
Yeah.
he's the professor and chair of Harvard neurology program. So, he even said he gave the keynote talk of this NIH sponsored workshop and said right out of the bat that right off the bat that uh, most people will have philosophical objections to this idea of what I'm going to be talking to you about. And that is the antimicrobial hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease or of amyloid functioning sort of from the perspective of an antimicrobial metabolite. So there are many, many implications to this idea that an infectious agent, and there are quite a few of them, there are many implications that many other disorders, including psychiatric disorders, too. And I think we could touch on that. But I
Yeah.
think maybe you can correct me that it was his work inspired by Rob Moyer, and he had passed away in 2019
Yeah.
of a glioblastoma. Right,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
but he was sort of a pioneer kind of
Yeah.
in this idea.
Yeah.
And so I guess just to put it very concisely, that amyloid beta is kind of, and I'm going referring to your notes, but it was also mentioned in his talk. Amyloid beta is the match that sort of kind of lights is the match that initiates the fire, and the inflammation is really the fire that's driving Alzheimer's disease. But what the elusive smoking gun is what lights the match, right? So
Right.
you have
Right.
inflammation, and we know lipopolysaccharide, LPS can drive beta
Mhm.
amyloid. And
Mhm.
then you have situations where there's not a, arguably not a profound, infectious agent, but you have CTE, you have traumatic brain injury, and these things
Right.
can lead to amyloid and tau.
Yeah.
But there are many other infectious agents, and then
Mhm.
there's probably in that talk from the people from Harvard and other people in the NIH workshop talked about the infectious agent and the inflammation, also the gene interaction. And we have APP and then presenilin 1,
Mhm.
presenilin 2, and then ApoE4, and I don't know,
Mhm.
maybe some other ones too. They're the
Oh,
ones that I know
yeah.
about. But you have this antimicrobial
Uh,
protection hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And I want to talk a little bit about that because no one's talking about that being kind of
mhm.
like the smoking gun. And just for
Yeah.
people out there, there's I'm going to say a fairly sizable body of literature talking
Mhm.
about fungal infections, herpes, HSV1.
Mhm.
You have like a dozen publications on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have HIV, of course, toxoplasmosis, hepatitis, cytomegalovirus,
Yeah.
uh,
Chlamydia.
chlamydia,
Yeah.
and
The Lyme,
Borrelia too.
Borrelia.
Pretty much
Mhm.
many
Yeah.
patients autopsy show neuroborreliosis or whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it.
Yeah.
So Borrelia, the
Yeah.
spirochetes, is in the
Yeah.
brain of like a
Yeah.
large majority of people with Alzheimer's disease.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I want to
Dental pathogens too, some of which
dental
are
pathogens.
spirochetes,
Yes.
also
Yep.
spirochetes. Syphilis is well known if it's untreated to cause dementia, and that's a
Yeah.
spirochete.
And
It's
that's
the
tested
same
for.
family
That's
of
actually,
organisms. Yeah.
yeah. So that's tested for. So I want to talk about
Yeah.
this idea of Uh, and I think this is sort of something that people thought was extremely fringe, but the brain microbiome. There's a lot of talk
Yeah.
about the gut
Yeah.
microbiome, but the
Hmm.
brain microbiome and microbes in the brain that could rapidly seed beta amyloid. And the beta
Hmm.
amyloid, my understanding is that these the tangles in the plaques can actually trap the microbe, and they function to track and neutralize the microbe.
Yeah.
And I think it was just eight different. I have a couple papers here. I'm just kind of looking. So beta amyloid kills at least eight of the common bacterial pathogens.
Hmm.
So that was super interesting to me, like,
Yeah.
in vitro studies. And there was some work that was done, I think, by University of Edinburgh, or maybe it was Sweden, where acyclovir given to patients where that had a reactivation of herpes simplex, or I think acyclovir maybe just used as a preventative measure. And this
Hmm.
was like, I want to fact check this, but there was like a 70% reduction in patients over a fairly large duration of time,
Yeah.
70% reduction in
Yeah. It was a pretty
Alzheimer's
big.
disease.
I
Yeah.
think it was more like 35 or 40%, but
Okay.
it was really impressive, because valacyclovir is especially good at crossing the blood-brain barrier, better than acyclovir.
Yeah.
But so people that were treated with one of these antiviral medications, and this became more available, I guess, after 2000 or 2005, that this particular antiviral became more available and was used this way. It often used prophylactically to prevent outbreaks, or if somebody senses that they're getting an outbreak, sometimes they'll have some tingling or something,
Yeah.
they can start taking it right away and it will shorten the duration of it. But basically, the drug keeps the virus from replicating. It doesn't inactivate it or kill it.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
keeps it from replicating, so it suppresses it. They use it during pregnancy too. Women with herpes simplex type 2, they don't want
Mhm.
that
Oh, that's
that to
right.
get to the
Yeah. Yeah.
baby, so they'll use it during
Yes.
pregnancy. So it's considered to be a really safe drug, and
Yeah.
but it does seem to prevent possibly Alzheimer's disease in people
Mhm.
that are prone to having these recurrences of herpes
Mhm.
simplex
And maybe,
infections.
yeah, some comments about Steve and him
Yeah,
having
yeah,
some cold sores, and
yeah.
maybe that being kind of feeding into this hypothesis,
Mhm.
which is very fringe, 10 years
Yeah,
ago. But now you have the NIH is having sponsored workshops about it. You got the chair of Harvard talking about it, and many top level academics are saying that we need to look at this.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that this ties into why these drugs that tackle beta amyloid are not effective or sometimes make things worse.
Yep. Yep.
So, Steve had a long history of constant fever blisters on his mouth. I mean, I have so many photos where he has a big fat fever blister on his lip.
Mhm.
And it was just always dealing with those. And it would, last for 7 or 10 days and would go away for a week or so and it would come back again. It was just kind of a constant battle. And when he was 29, we had just moved from Cincinnati to Charleston and he was sick on the way down. I had to drive our moving van to South Carolina because he could hardly sit up. He was nauseated. And
Mhm.
as soon as we arrived, he broke out with blisters all around one of his eyes. I think it was his left eye. And he might have had, I mean, there's a herpes encephalitis. You can have a mild
Yeah.
to severe herpes encephalitis. And
Like a headache. Does that start with a
yeah,
headache or just
headache
like
and
brain fog?
nausea.
And
He really
yeah.
couldn't sit up. He was, really weak. I mean, it was like, here we are in the middle of traveling, when this happens and moving literally. They didn't have the drugs like readily available yet, at that time. This would have been in 1980.
Yeah.
So he was 29 years old. And he
And
told me he never felt the same cognitively after that. He was an accountant. He said that he felt like if he hadn't worked for me after that, that he would have been fired, probably would have been fired. But I thought he was functioning okay, but he knew something was wrong for quite a while, before I started noticing symptoms. And but he tied it to that, directly. And so when we started the coconut oil, one of the interesting things that happened was he rarely ever had another one again. Over the next 8 years, that he lived
Mhm.
after that, he had four tiny outbreaks. One was after he started getting semagasistat,
Mhm.
and he had, after doing really well for almost 2 years, he had started having some new Alzheimer's symptoms, and he had like he didn't recognize. He said to me literally one day, we're staying in the mirror together, and he says, he said, that's you. And he says, from the neck down, this is me. He said, but from the neck up, it doesn't look like me. He's talking about
Mhm.
himself. He said it didn't look like himself in the mirror. And I
Yeah.
was like, what in the world, what is going on? And then
Mhm.
later he would think it was his father in the mirror, when he would look in the
Wow.
mirror.
Mhm.
But that
Yeah.
was one example. He started wandering. He'd say, I'm going to go visit my brothers who were 700 miles away. And, some strange things like that started happening and needing a lot more assistance with. I had to talk him through taking a shower and shaving, and he had been able to do that by himself up to that point. So kind of a big decline over 6 weeks. But one of the things that happened, he had a cold and he broke out. He had just a small fever blister. It wasn't even very
Yeah.
big. But each time he had that, it was like 4 times during that next 8 years, he had a setback. He would get more confused, and
Yeah.
even like if he was on the ketone ester and that happened, he would, have a setback. And over time, he would seem to usually recover, but basically back even in I think it was 2009, I started thinking, always wondering what triggered this. Somebody who's as young as he was, why would they just get something like this? And I thought about infections, and then I look up herpes simplex virus, thinking about the eye infection and Alzheimer's. I look it up, and here's this big body of work already by Dr. Ruth Saki and Mark Wands in the UK, and she had been working on this, or they had since the mid 1990s.
Mhm.
And they had a whole series of studies that they had done, and they had even shown that infecting mice with herpes simplex virus caused plaques and tangles to form. They
Mhm.
had shown this, and now many other people have shown this as well, in the
Yeah.
various studies. And she had been pushing for years and years to do a valaciclovir study, and he couldn't get funding for it in the UK. So these studies are relatively new, that they've finally been able to do this. Well, I think they looked retrospectively first, and then they were able maybe to do, or maybe they're about to do a prospective trial, a
Mhm.
valacyclovir. But
Yeah.
that was really intriguing. So I actually contacted her, and she suggested that I give him valacyclovir. So I
Mhm.
did start giving that to him to try to suppress it, and he basically did have that for the rest of his life. He still have, it suppresses, but it's not 100%. And
Did he
so he
still have
has
breakouts?
he would still have, like 4 times he had a minor outbreak that was
Uh-huh.
usually a much smaller and seemed to be shorter lasting,
Yeah.
than when,
And what
before
was
he
the
started taking
dosage?
it.
I know the dosage is used different for a breakout, right? And then there's like a
Yeah, you
preventative
ramp it
dose
up.
and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying
Okay.
to remember. I
Like
can't
a
remember
thousand
right off what the
milligrams or
dose
something like
is.
that.
I could try to look it up,
Yeah.
but yeah. So he was getting it prophylactically all the time, and then
Hmm.
we did increase it if he actually had an
Yeah.
outbreak. Luckily, it wasn't very much, but he had already, before we were even doing that for a year, he had maybe one, during that whole year after we started coconut
Yeah.
oil, so trying to understand why that happened. I learned that lauric acid, which is C12, which is half of coconut
Hmm.
oil, um, is highly antimicrobial. It kills the herpes simplex virus. It kills
Hmm.
it inactivates. Well, it really kills them. It inactivates. They can't replicate after that.
Hmm.
But viruses that have a lipid capsule, it dissolves the lipid capsule of the virus. And that includes coronavirus. So there have been studies in Singapore and the Philippines showing in vitro studies, that it does inactivate the coronavirus as well. So, but lauric acid kills numerous bacteria, dental pathogens, bacteria that cause acne.
Yeah.
It kills the Lyme spirochete. It kills,
Yeah.
all kinds of bacteria, chlamydia, many fungus, candida.
Hmm.
Many of these organisms that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease.
Should we
Through
be
all the
brushing our
research.
teeth with
I do it. I've been
with
brushing my
coconut
teeth.
oil? I've
Yeah,
heard people talk
yeah.
about this. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Instead of
there's,
fluoride based, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So there's this thing. It's called oil pooling. That it's part of
Hmm.
Ayurvedic medicine in India for
Hmm.
4,000 years. And people put oil in their mouth and you swish it around in your mouth for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes and spit it out. And
Hmm.
it's supposed to remove uh, bacteria and other things like that. But
Hmm.
coconut oil in particular has been used for this because of the lauric acid in it, that it
Yeah.
it does kill these pathogens. So I started doing oil pulling at first, and I thought, why don't I just brush my teeth with it? So this is
Hmm.
people think I'm crazy sometimes, but I don't ever use toothpaste. I
Hmm.
just use coconut oil. And if you spit it into your pipe's going to be cold and it will turn solid and it will clog up your sink. I found that out the hard
Oh,
way. So
good
I
to know.
just
Yeah.
I just spit it like into a little Dixie cup or something,
Uh-huh.
and throw it in the garbage. But and and I haven't had a single new cavity or crown for over 15 years since I
Hmm.
started doing
Great.
this.
Yeah.
And I used to routinely have cavities and have a number of crowns that I had put in before that. And
Mhm.
it's like, I don't know, when you have a dental cleaning, sometimes you'll have bleeding or whatever, I
Yeah.
don't have that problem. I don't, all of my, the hygienists say, wow, you do a good job of flossing. It's like, well, guess what? I use a water pick now, but
Yeah.
it really, it kills well, there's this microfilm that forms on the teeth, and
Yep.
these spirochetes and other organisms, cause this film that causes
Yep.
plaque, cause
Yep.
dental caries.
Yep.
But coconut oil kills those. The lauric acid
Biofilms.
kills those.
Yeah.
Yeah, the biofilms. So
Yeah.
I really rarely have much accumulation of plaque, which is
Hmm.
so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do recommend it. I do recommend it.
Mhm.
Brushing your
Yeah.
teeth with coconut
Interesting.
oil.
Yeah, I do that. I do like the baking soda. I should do the
Mhm.
coconut oil stuff, but yeah, I went like 7 years without the dentist one time and they're like, oh yeah, you're not that bad actually. So I had like a little, but I
Yeah,
think low carb ketogenic diets too also,
yeah, yeah.
contribute
Sugar.
to
Yeah,
that.
definitely causes dental decay. It contributes to that.
Yeah.
You
So
do.
in regards to the smoking gun, I mean, there are
Yeah,
many different
yeah,
pathogens. I'm reviewing some of the notes here, and there's about a dozen different pathogens that are pathophysiologically
yeah,
linked to this,
yeah.
disorder. And the number of papers, there are 6,000 papers. If you do a PubMed link going back from 1947 to more now, well, probably approaching 7,000 papers on Alzheimer's disease and infection,
Mhm.
which is astronaut. I feel like a lot of this data and this idea has been kind of suppressed
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
uh and it's not, well, it's finally getting the attention that it deserves from top level academics and
From
even
NIH
the
getting
NIH,
funding. Yeah.
yeah, National Institutes of
Yeah.
Aging associated with the NIH.
Hmm.
So maybe some like actionable things that people could do
Hmm.
if they think they may
Hmm.
harbor. And I guess the thing is, we all harbor these microbes. I
Element.
mean, herpes
Yeah.
simplex, right? It's like someone my
Right.
age, like 50, is going to have like 70%,
Yeah. There's a
right?
good
Of
chance.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, of it. So,
Yeah.
but most people, a large percentage of people are asymptomatic or just have periodic
Yeah. They're
like
carriers,
outbreaks.
but they don't have an
Yeah,
infection, so to speak,
yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, herpes simplex. I mean, it lives in nerves. It just lies dormant there and it breaks out. And,
Hmm.
the mouth, these trigeminal nerves and the nerves from the mouth, the root of them in the brain is near the amygdala and hippocampus.
And the
But
trigeminal nerve, can it go up the
yeah, trigeminal.
trigeminal
Yeah,
yeah, uh-huh.
yeah.
Yep.
So, the virus, potentially could erupt in the brain too. When maybe there's
Hmm.
an outbreak on the mouth, well, it could be erupting other places along the pathway as well, and
Yep.
maybe in the brain. And like Steve, the path his the Lewy bodies that he had were mainly in the amygdala,
Hmm.
which is where close to where the root of the trigeminal nerve is. And they were throughout the limbic system, is what they said. And that's exactly the path that herpes simplex encephalitis travels through the
Hmm.
limbic system.
Yep.
So I felt strongly that that infection that he had might have been the smoking gun for him. I think there are a lot of smoking guns, and
Yeah.
it's just that, beta amyloid, it's a very primitive metabolite, I guess you would call it, or substance, that it seems to, well, what they say, I mean, soluble beta amyloid is not toxic. It's a necessary,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
substance that has a lot of important functions, and part of it is this antimicrobial function. Apparently, it doesn't matter what organism. It's a foreign body. They also find all kinds of heavy metals in them. In them.
Hmm.
Lead and mercury, cadmium, iron, copper. Calcium carbonate. They find in these plaques.
Huh. Uh-huh.
So, and then recently I was reading something about plastic being
Wow.
in
Microplastics. Uh-huh.
atheromas in the heart, little tiny microscopic shards of plastic and PVC they're finding in
Oh,
plaques
I saw
in
that
the
paper. Yeah.
arteries. Yeah,
Hmm.
did you see that? Yeah. So I
And
look it
the
up
salt plaque.
Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
there's
Or the
some
hard plaque.
studies
Yep.
of this for
Hmm.
Alzheimer's too. So basically foreign bodies. It's a response. I think it's a primitive immunological response to basically try to contain, and they said even in that presentation that you were talking about, I got to look at it too. Even one virus will stimulate a whole plaque to form.
Yeah.
So this
They,
substance that's its part of its function is to help contain, I think.
yeah.
And and then the tangles. Tansy spoke a little bit about this, and I've kind of communicated with him too about it, that the tangles seem to also be involved in this immune response. And it could be that, when a tangle forms, basically it's the skeleton of the neuron, the axons and dendrites.
Hmm.
But it kind of wads up in the nucleus, or not in the nucleus, but in the body of the neuron, and the cell dies. And
Hmm.
it could be a way of preventing spread.
Hmm.
This cell has been taken over by the virus. It becomes a virus replicating machine. That's what
Yeah.
viruses do to cells. And to stop the spread, this happens, that the tau tangle forms, and
Yeah.
potentially prevent the spread. And there's collateral damage, when that happens. That happens with any infection. If there's an abscess or you have a wound infection, there's going to be scarring and collateral damage. And it happens in the lung with pneumonia, scarring, and you're more likely to get it again, but it's a way of containing it and maybe preserving the whole organism,
Hmm.
but
Yep.
at the expense of some tissue, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, my thinking on it. And so I think these drugs that, that they're targeting removal of it, it's like, well, you're removing a substance that fights infection. So you may be
Yeah.
opening up a can of worms. And I do think that that could be what happened with Steve. Even just 6 weeks on the drug was enough to trigger another, outbreak,
An
of
autoimmune
that.
response too,
Yeah,
maybe. I mean, they're
yeah,
attacking other proteins. And in
yeah.
the talk, they did talk about with an acute infection, whether it be
Mhm.
bacterial or viral. I guess what they described as like almost popcorn plaques. Like they used the term that they would pop up so fast in the
Yeah,
brain, like
yeah,
popcorn.
very
Like they
fast.
would just, yeah, they
Like within
quickly
24, 36 hours, they would pop up.
self-assemble. Yeah, it gave this vision of like,
Yeah,
popcorn plaques like rapidly forming in
yeah.
response to an acute infection when the viral load was high or there was viral shedding.
Mhm, mhm,
And it just made me think, sort of bringing it back to metabolic health, that we know dietary interventions,
mhm,
ketogenic diets. I think there was like a Nature paper that showed that can dramatically increase, even a 2 week ketogenic diet can increase adaptive immunity. A
mhm,
vegan diet can potentially increase innate immunity. I mean, that was sort of the conclusion on this,
mhm,
but I do think a well-formulated ketogenic diet can do both, like,
mhm, mhm,
enhance the innate immunity, dramatically probably enhance the adaptive immunity.
mhm, mhm.
From the
Yeah,
context of cancer, there are oncologists that are really very much interested in this now, sort of further augmenting the use of checkpoint inhibitors like PD-1 inhibitors and using
mhm,
ketogenic therapies as a pre
mhm,
sort of as a run into the use of those drugs to further
mhm.
enhance the use of those
Yeah.
drugs. So we know that, these dietary therapies and also components of the diet, maybe certain supplements, ketone supplements, and things like that, are a way that can not only augment the immune system in a way to help fight infection, uh, but also have a profound anti-inflammatory effect. And it's really the inflammation. Like you could have an
Yeah,
infection, but if you don't have the
right,
inflammation is driving.
right,
So the general consensus among all these academics is that it's the inflammation that's the fire that really drives
right. The
Alzheimer's
forest
disease. So,
fire. I think he called it the
yeah,
forest fire,
the forest
but
fire.
yeah,
Yeah,
he
brush
called
fire.
it
Yep. Yep.
the tangles, the brush fire, and the inflammation, the forest fire
Yeah.
was how he
Yep.
put it. And that makes sense. Yeah, you still have to go back to, so what triggered the match, what caused the match to light, In
Yeah.
Steve's case, I think it could have been Vioxx, an
Uh-huh.
anti-inflammatory,
Yeah.
might allow an infection to thrive, so to
Proliferate.
speak,
Yep. Yep.
proliferate, and you know,
And we know it happens with syphilis. I mean, that's well documented,
yeah,
but
yeah.
there's fungal infections now. I'm just looking at the list
Yeah,
of there's, like I said, there's
yeast
over,
candida is very common. A lot of people have,
yeah.
I mean, they
Hmm.
have oral candida, they have it through their bowel, they have,
Yep.
mhm.
Yeah. This is not like
Taking
one or two
antibiotics.
papers.
Yeah,
Yeah. We're talking like
antibiotics wipe
7,000
out.
papers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
ton of papers. And
Yeah.
there's only been one session ever at the Alzheimer's Association conference. I got to go to that one. I think it was in London, and they assembled, it was more like a debate. They had a couple
Hmm.
people, Ruth Sasaki was there, and Redhead, he spoke,
Hmm.
uh, and Rob Moore had passed away already. Moyer
Hmm.
had
Uh-huh.
already passed away. He was like the driving force, for
Yep.
this. And I think
Yep.
he is an umbrella, that Tansy is oversees, so to speak, but he was in his lab, and he's really helped keep the work going, with other
Mhm.
people there. But they had a
Yeah.
debate. There were other people were saying, "Oh no, no, it's prions. It's not bacteria." And prions spread from, and it's like, well, how is that different than a virus? Viruses spread from cell to cell, so why wouldn't it be a
Hmm.
virus? That's the way I
Yeah.
look at it. I mean, it could be prions. I mean, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a prion.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Yeah. Yeah.
Jakob, yeah,
Yeah.
Jakob.
Yeah.
I didn't say it right, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Bovine
that mad cow
encephalitis. Yeah.
disease, mad
Yeah.
cow
Mad
disease
cow.
causes
Yeah.
dementia, and so they're
Yeah.
they're thinking of something like that. Well, that probably is one of the things that
Yeah.
causes it, But why
Yeah.
not? Viruses, they spread cell to cell, and like
Mhm.
coronavirus, actually, this virus figured out how to fuse cell membranes, so it doesn't even have to go, extracellularly to get to the next cell. It can just go from
Mhm.
cell to cell right through
Yeah.
merge the cell membrane walls.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So just like cancer, I think I think everyone can agree at this point in time.
Mhm.
There's probably not a general consensus at the moment, but Alzheimer's disease is multifactorial. And
Yeah.
as with cancer, you have the oncogenic paradox, right? So many
Mhm.
different provocative agents can induce transformation of a normal cell to a healthy cell, and it's
Mhm.
pathophysiologically
Yeah.
linked. Could be to damaging the DNA or damaging the
Yeah.
mitochondria.
Yeah.
So mitochondria
Yeah.
induces an energetic crisis, which
Mhm.
the hallmark characteristic of Alzheimer's disease is glucose hypometabolism.
Right.
So you have that, and a driver for that. I mean, just kind of stepping back, I always viewed it as metabolic dysregulation, and that could
Mhm.
be from the context of, the GLUT3 and, internalization of the glucose transporters. Pyruvate dehydrogenase complex
Yeah.
is
Those are
less of
deficient.
it, less. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's well established, and
Yeah.
it's the catalytic the activity of it is
Hmm.
reduced, and that's why ketosis can overcome the glycolytic metabolism to feed.
Right.
So, but what causes that? So that could be a vascular etiology, but everybody agrees that it's that neuroinflammation is a driver. I think that's the only
Yeah.
thing that people
Yeah.
kind of agree on.
Yeah.
Uh, and the infectious agent hypothesis is more and more compelling, the more that I look at it. And I just want to mention, our mutual friend, Dr. Vince Tadone, who
Oh, yeah.
has kind of zeroed in on Lyme's disease and
Yeah.
Borrelia, which is, it was not really talked about. Maybe it was mentioned briefly in that NIH workshop, but just based on the number of emails I have and just communication with other people, and
Yeah.
actually being in relatively marginalized workshops where they talk about Borrelia and Lyme disease and other,
Yeah.
most zeroed in on Lyme disease. I think that could be one of the big smoking guns, because
Yeah. I think so too.
the rapid, I think I just saw, like, if we test everybody, even by CDC standards, which are not
Mhm.
very good, even by CDC standards, like 14%, and I think some estimates of maybe 20% will show that we've had Lyme disease.
Mhm.
So that's pretty high, and we're probably
Yeah, it is.
missing a lot of cases because the testing's not very good. The Borrelia hides, and it's like you
Yeah.
have to do a
Yeah.
provocative test to really,
Can be hard to
you know,
treat. Yeah.
yeah,
Or
yep.
not treated with the right thing sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've read that there are at least 250,000 cases a year in the U.S. of
yeah,
that are documented, and
yeah,
a lot of other ones, others that aren't. And
yeah.
I mean, I wonder about that one for Steve too. He was tested at one point, but that sometimes the testing isn't that good. But
I
he got tick
tested.
bites. He got tick bites. He used to be
I
out in
did
the yard
too.
all the time, and so we would worry about that. I met a couple people that had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They had really
Hmm.
significant symptoms. And then they found out, I mean, they were tested and treated for Lyme disease and they got better. I mean, they got
Hmm.
completely better. Chris Christopherson, the singer, he's a case of that. Yeah, I
Hmm.
have him in one of my books, but exactly that happened with him where he had symptoms and then he was treated for Lyme's and he got better.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so it's intriguing and
Yeah.
like I say, somebody who is young who suddenly develops something that serious and ALS. I mean, it could be any number. Early onset Parkinson's disease.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's another mystery. What causes that? And well, Spanish flu. After the Spanish flu epidemic, there was a big onslaught of people who developed Parkinson's disease.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I saw a really interesting presentation where they inoculated the stomach of mice with the Spanish flu virus. They still have the virus and they were able to show that it traveled retrograde up the vagus nerve into the brain and infected
Wow.
the
Hmm.
brain with
Yep.
Spanish flu in the mice. So they think
Yep.
that may have been the mechanism,
Well,
for Parkinson's.
COVID too. That was
Yeah.
part of the conversation that NIH workshop talked about. I think the COVID, or maybe that was another workshop I was listening to
Yeah.
on, an infectious agent. So, well, Mary, we've gone almost
Yeah.
2 hours now,
Yeah.
and I still have a lot of notes, but I do want to revisit your topic, your next book too. So
Okay.
maybe that could be
Oh yeah.
another podcast in and of
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah. I'm excited about that. I'm working
Yeah.
on it now and just submitted a paper that hopefully will get accepted. It's really, really long, so I don't know if they'll
Uh-huh.
take it quite that way. But the
Are you
trans
the only author? Do you have any co-authors?
no,
Yeah.
Dr. Fabian Dayrit, he goes by
Oh,
Toby in the
yeah.
Philippines. He's a
Yeah. Okay.
biochemist,
That's right. Yep. Hmm.
and he and I just both have this passion about the dietary guidelines for Americans and how it's really resulted in this epidemic of metabolic diseases, obesity and diabetes and
Hmm.
autism, Alzheimer's and other dementias, just kind of gone off the charts, since these guidelines went into effect.
Hmm.
And so we were both, really interested in this. We decided to co-write this paper. Him being a chemist, he really tackled Keith's had an equation, to try to predict what would happen to cholesterol levels when you consume, saturated versus polyunsaturated fats. And he had so many fats that it just didn't work out for, and coconut oil was one of them.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, it was used to design numerous dietary studies. So he kind of concentrated on some of that. And I had read all of these big reports of all of these major studies and
Hmm.
just, took in copious notes. And I've done all kinds of calculations of, the data in there. But,
Yeah.
really the big flaw was that this whole time that they were doing these studies in the US and Europe, like the 7 countries study, and even in Japan, trans fats were really in the population.
Mm.
I found one thing from 1995, where they said that throughout the 1960s to 80s in the US, virtually every salad and cooking oil in American homes had trans fats in it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And I think of trans fats as being largely solid, but I guess yeah, they do
Oh,
come in.
yeah. And that's
Yeah,
why
like
they
Crisco. That's what I think
conflated.
about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So when they
Yep.
talked about saturated fat, they were talking about solid fat. They
Hmm.
would always say solid fats. So in these
Hmm.
studies, they would group together margarine and butter, lard, and shortening. The shortenings
Yeah.
and the margarines were loaded with trans fats. Some of them had up to
Yeah.
40 or so percent trans fats in them.
Wow.
And these were in all American homes. I mean, I grew up with Crisco and
Oh
margarine
yeah.
in the house. We
Hmm.
didn't have butter, and then we
No.
had I think Western oil that was probably partially hydrogenated, loaded with
Yeah.
trans fats. And
All the peanut butter had,
Yep,
partially
peanut butter.
hydrogenated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it had
Yeah.
soybean oil and
Keep
hydrogenated
it.
fats in that. And
Yeah. Keep it
yeah,
from separating
so
out from the oil. Yeah, the peanuts.
yeah. So
Wow.
they didn't differentiate these when they were
Yeah.
doing, it was basically solid fats, and they were including natural saturated fats and trans fats. And this one study, the National Diet Heart Study in particular, they deliberately they they were trying to blind everybody, including the control group, and they had 30 food companies, and this was something that it was the American Heart Association that got this diet going. They had major fundraising for it. This was like in 1957. They started fundraising. They got grants from the NIH to, and the idea was to test fabricated fat modified foods
Mhm.
um, using the prudent diet, trying to test high versus low fat and replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. Well, the
Mhm.
saturated fats that they use in these foods they created for this diet included heavily hydrogenated oils and fats,
Wow. Hmm.
shortenings,
Yeah.
margarines. They had pastries, they had cookies, they had emulsions
Yeah.
that fake eggs, they had fake ice cream, they had cheese loaves that were imitation, and
Mm-hmm.
they manipulated the oils depending on what group they were in. So if they were in the high saturated fat group, they were getting 18% saturated fat, but it could have included, had shortenings and margarines were
Yeah.
part of
Shortenings. Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
Yeah, they had, and then the ones who were in the polyunsaturated group were getting partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, so they were getting trans fats
Wow.
too.
Yeah.
Everybody was getting trans fats,
Wow.
and but all the men, because they had to buy certain foods or meats and everything, they filled meat, sausages, and patties with the oils, whatever group they were in, they filled them with the correct oils, you
Hmm.
know. So they did all this stuff to foods, and they basically told them, not to eat eggs, and to only drink skim milk. They would give them an emulsion if they wanted fat in their milk.
Hmm.
To trim all the meat. Like if they got any meat, they had to trim the fat off the meat. They had to look for
Hmm.
meat that had very little marbling in it,
Hmm.
and no egg. Well, I already said that, but basically they weren't allowed to eat animal fats,
Hmm.
and these would be provided by. But they all got trans fats,
Wow. So you
and
wrote,
all the groups.
yeah, so you have a publication. I don't want to go any further because
Yeah,
this is a whole
yeah,
topic of another podcast.
right.
Maybe you
Yeah,
could send me like the book or
I'll
the
send you
paper in
the.
advance, and I'll come up with a bunch of questions, provocative questions, because
Okay,
this will
okay.
be a topic of high interest to our listeners. This
Yeah,
particular
yeah,
topic.
I think
Well,
so. And
well,
so I'm writing a book about it too.
mhm.
I just, we wanted to get this paper out first, and
Yeah,
because of the
cool.
dietary guidelines for Americans, the revision going on
Mhm.
now,
Yeah,
we want that to
yeah,
be out there, because they need to
2025.
consider
Mhm.
this. They still say
Yeah,
limit saturated fat to less than 10%.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
because in the studies, people were getting saturated and trans fats that were
yeah.
meant saturated fat.
Yep. Wow, that's I don't
Yeah,
think people know this, so I can't wait to read
yeah,
the paper and read the book.
yeah.
And I want to thank you, Mary, for your
You're
time. We've
welcome.
gone 2 hours here. How can
Yeah.
people find you and what are the
Ah.
best I mean your books, we plugged your books, but please feel free to plug them again and your website
Oh,
and
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so this is the latest one that came out. This is the third edition of my first book, Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Was a Cure, the story of ketones. And then the Clearly Keto book that has
Yes.
forward by
Mhm.
Dominic and Melanie Brown. And that one came out in 2022. And I have another one called The Coconut and Low Carb Solution. It's a much easier book
Oh
to
yeah,
read.
I remember you telling me about that. Yeah.
I meant it to be kind of a little manual to follow up the
Hmm.
first book because people had trouble finding the diet in the
Hmm.
other.
Hmm.
And so my website is coconutketones.com,
Hmm.
COCONUTKETONES.com. And there's an email contact in there that people can
Hmm.
get to me that way.
Great. Great.
And all my books, they're on Amazon. They're on all the book websites. So
I'm sure you get a lot of emails. Well, thank you,
I
Mary,
do. I
for
do. Yeah.
your sharing your expertise,
Mhm.
your
Oh,
wisdom, and your personal story, especially with
yeah.
your husband and all the communication from people, all the anecdotal reports that you've
Mhm.
compiled are super informative. And thank you everybody for listening to the Metabolic Link podcast. Please feel free to give us a glowing recommendation. Feel free to please like the podcast. That helps us get more visibility for it. And we look forward to having Dr. Mary Newport on again to talk about her new book coming up. And thank you all, and hope you tune in again to the next podcast of the Metabolic Link. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Metabolic Link. If you've liked this episode, please be sure to leave us a review, share it, or drop us a comment. If you want more content like this, including access to our private podcast feed that offers exclusive ad-free episodes, that also provides continuing medical education for physicians, please visit our medical education platform, the Metabolic Initiative, at membership.metabolicinitiative.com. Your first 7 days are free. Thank you again for tuning in.
Do you love learning about metabolic health? So do we. It's why we created the Metabolic Initiative, an online educational platform providing evidence-based education on metabolic health and therapies for healthcare professionals and the general public. By joining the Metabolic Initiative, you'll gain access to hundreds of expert lectures, interviews, panel discussions, and even private episodes of the Metabolic Link. CMEs are available. Go to metabolicinitiative.com to get started. And as always, thank you for listening to the Metabolic Link.